Welcome to HistSleep, where the past drifts in softly, like a candle flickering in an empty hall. Tonight, we step quietly into the private world of a queen who ruled an empire yet carried a secret she never dared to speak aloud. Settle in. The story begins. On quiet winter evenings, long after the fires in Whitehall had burned down to gentle embers, Queen Elizabeth would sometimes sit alone in her private chamber, motionless, almost statuesque, as if carved from the same cold stone that held up the palace walls. Her lady Sin, waiting, knew the ritual well. A whisper of dismissed footsteps, a slow closing of the heavy wooden door, and then the soft, aching silence that followed. To the world, beyond those guarded walls, Elizabeth was a miracle of her age, sharp as a blade, bold as a storm, a woman who commanded kingdoms with a raised eyebrow. But inside that stillness, when the sun slipped behind the edge of England and the court musicians retired their instruments, something else lingered behind the Queen's eyes, a shadow, a quiet tension, a pain she never named aloud. Most chroniclers wrote of her brilliance, her temper, her impossible standards, but they never wrote about the nights when the Queen pressed her palm to her chest, as if steadying something inside her, or the way she would pause just for a moment when laughter erupted in the chambers below, her expression tightening with an emotion no one dared to decipher. Elizabeth Tudor carried many burdens, but one burden accompanied her from her earliest memories to her final breath, a secret illness, subtle yet relentless, that shaped her entire life in ways the world never saw. The court only sensed fragments, a faint tremor in her hands during council meetings, sudden bouts of exhaustion that she hid behind fans and witty remarks, the careful way she stood, avoiding sudden movements that might betray her weakness. The Queen's physicians, bound more by superstition than science, tiptoed around her symptoms with polite guesses and outdated remedies. They did not diagnose her. They could not. England's sovereign had to appear unbreakable, and so her secret remained what it always had been, hers alone. But the roots of this hidden struggle stretched far deeper than any physician understood. They began not in the palace's glittering halls, but in the early, haunted years of Elizabeth's childhood years, carved with fear, loss, and the chilling knowledge that the world could turn against a Tudor daughter in a heartbeat. She was barely 3 years old when she watched her mother's name vanish from the royal court. Anne Boleyn, a woman once adored, envied, despised, was erased as if she had never existed. Elizabeth never saw the execution herself. No one would have allowed that. Yet children absorb truths through the soft, unspoken spaces adults fail to fill. She felt the tension in the air, heard the sudden hush that fell whenever her mother's name appeared in conversation, saw servants exchange tight, worried glances, and then, worst of all, she saw her own status collapse overnight, like a tower of cards knocked down by a careless hand. A princess one day, a motherless, unwanted child the next. Those early years taught her something the rest of the world didn't realize she understood. Safety was an illusion. Power was fragile. Love even, parental love was conditional. Her secret illness emerged quietly around that time, as if fear itself had planted the seed. Some days her heartbeat raced for no reason at all, fluttering in her chest like a bird desperate to escape its cage. On other days, she felt lightheaded, unsteady, as though the ground beneath her feet had shifted. There were nights when she woke struggling for breath, trembling under the weight of nightmares she could never fully recall. No one gave it a name. No one offered an explanation. No one held her long enough to ask whether she was afraid. The Tudor court valued control above all else, and young Elizabeth learned to hide her discomfort with a precision far beyond her years. She learned to breathe slowly when her chest tightened, learned to smile when her vision blurred at the edges, learned to stand tall even when her body protested. By the time she became queen at 25, she was a master of concealment. Her illness had woven itself into her identity so completely that she rarely distinguished where her real self ended and her mask began. Still, even a queen cannot hide everything. There were but unmistakable when those closest to her saw the cracks. A sudden hesitation before rising from her throne, a hand gripping the edge of a jeweled armrest just a little too tightly, a faint wince as she turned her head, as if a sharp pain pulsed beneath her collar. Her advisors chalked it up to fatigue or stress or the overwhelming responsibilities of ruling an empire. But her ladies noticed more than that. They saw the subtle signs behind the scenes. The way she sometimes needed to sit down abruptly after long audiences, the pale color that drained from her cheeks after courtly dances, the hours she spent awake long after midnight, pacing the floor in slow, deliberate steps. They never questioned her. Of course, no one questioned the Virgin Queen, but whispers spread through the palace, like soft winds slipping under doors. They said she pushed herself too hard. They said she refused to rest. They said she carried a hidden struggle that no crown could erase. Yet Elizabeth never spoke of it, not to her council, not to her confidants, not even to herself. She believed that naming a weakness was the same as surrendering to it, and surrender was something she would never do. Not after surviving the storms of her youth, not after proving herself capable in a world that doubted her every step. Instead, she turned her illness into a shadow companion, unwanted but familiar. It followed her through wars, alliances, betrayals, and triumphs. It stood beside her as she faced foreign kings who underestimated her. It lingered behind her as she delivered fiery speeches to her soldiers. It crept into her chambers at night like a loyal but merciless phantom. Sometimes she wondered whether the shadow had saved her life as much as it tormented her. It made her cautious when others urged risk. It kept her emotionally distant when suitors pressed their proposals. It reminded her that even a queen had limits, even if she pretended otherwise. But above all, it made her fiercely independent. She trusted no one with her weakness, least of all men who wished to marry her. For Elizabeth, marriage meant vulnerability. It meant letting someone close enough to see past the flawless facade she had spent decades perfecting. And the thought terrified her more than any battlefield. So she sat alone on those winter nights, pressing her palm against her chest as if studying something deeper than her heartbeats, something closer to a lifelong fear. She was one of the most powerful women in history. Yet behind the grandeur and the legend lived a woman who fought her own body in silence. A woman who carried a secret she never spoke aloud. And though England never knew it, that secret shaped the destiny of a nation. It would influence her judgments, her alliances, her refusals, and the future of the entire Tudor line. It would become the quiet force behind decisions historians still debate, and it would remain locked within Elizabeth's heart until the day that heart finally gave out. But for now, for this first chapter, she remained the lone figure in a dimly lit chamber, staring into the hearth, as if searching its embers for answers she never dared to voice. Her secret was only beginning to leave its mark on the world. why Elizabeth's childhood shadows followed her into the throne room. Even as England celebrated the rise of a young queen crowned with golden promise, Elizabeth Tudor carried the ghosts of her childhood like silent companions at her side. They walked with her into every council chamber, lingered behind every royal decree, and settled quietly in the corners of her mind shadows she never managed to escape, no matter how brightly the throne room glittered. Most rulers inherit political problems. Elizabeth inherited memories. Memories that had shaped her long before she ever held a understand the queen she became. One must understand the child she once was, a girl growing up in a court, trembling with fear, suspicion, and a king whose moods could decide the fate of anyone bold enough or unfortunate enough to stand before him. Her earliest recollections were not of lullabies or soft maternal embraces. They were of hurried footsteps, hushed arguments, and the unsettling truth that adults whispered more lies than children ever could. She learned early that affection in the Tudor palace was conditional, shifting like the wind, especially for a girl whose mother had been declared a traitor. In the palace corridors, servants rarely met her eyes. Royal tutors corrected her too sharply, as if they feared being connected to her. And every portrait of her mother had vanished, burned, buried, or quietly removed, as if Anne Boleyn had been a bad dream the kingdom wanted to forget. Elizabeth grew up with the knowledge that a single decision from Henry VIII could destroy families, reputations, entire lives. That knowledge burrowed deep into the girl who loved stories, languages, and music. The girl who desperately wished for someone to look at her without fear or judgment. But the strangest part of her childhood was the loneliness. Not the kind born from physical isolation, but the kind that builds when everyone around you is afraid to get close. Her first shadow formed the year her mother died. She wasn't told the truth. No one dared explain. They simply replaced every familiar face with someone new and expected her to behave as if nothing had changed. But children notice the silences adults try to hide. Elizabeth noticed everything. She noticed the way her governess avoided certain words. She noticed how her father's visits became less frequent, more formal. She noticed the subtle shift in her, clothing from rich fabrics to simpler ones. And she noticed that no one spoke her mother's name anymore. In that silence grew a question she would carry for the rest of her life. If love could vanish overnight, what else could be taken from her without warning? By the time she reached adolescence, Elizabeth had become a master at reading people, their intentions, their moods, their hidden motives. She could sense danger long before it surfaced. She could tell when a compliment was a trap, when a gift came with strings, when a smile concealed ambition. These instincts, forged in childhood chaos, would later save her life more times than any soldier or advisor ever would. Yet, the shadows were not merely emotional. Some of them lived in her body. There were illnesses during her early years, mysterious spells of weakness that left her pale and trembling. Court physicians offered vague explanations, blaming the humors, the air, or the phases of the moon. But Elizabeth knew better. She knew her body responded to fear the way a horseshoe responds to fire, bending, reshaping, stiffening under pressure. When her father executed Catherine Howard, Elizabeth, only a young teenager, felt a familiar dread rise inside her. Another stepmother accused, Another woman destroyed. Another reminder that the world around her thrived on uncertainty. And then came the Seymour scandal. Thomas Seymour, charming and reckless, paid too much attention to the young Elizabeth when she lived under the care of Catherine Parr. He slipped into her rooms at dawn, tickled her through the bed curtains, and whispered things no guardian should whisper. Catherine tried to intervene, but the damage was done. Elizabeth learned another lesson that would never leave her. Men could be dangerous even when they claimed affection. Historians often reduce this episode to gossip, but for Elizabeth, it was something deeper, a violation of safety, trust, and innocence. It became another shadow that would later shape her refusal to marry, her guarded heart, and her unshakable commitment to her own autonomy. Years later, when she finally took her place on the throne, these shadows followed her into the glittering hall. She felt them in the sudden tightness in her chest during heated debates. She heard them in the echo of footsteps behind her, reminding her of nights spent listening to her father rage. She saw them in the wary eyes of courtiers who treated her with respect but never truly with warmth, had taught her to expect betrayal as naturally as others expected kindness. So, even as she stood crowned and triumphant, she kept her guard up. Always, her advisors misread it as pride. Foreign ambassadors mistook it for arrogance. But the truth was simpler. Elizabeth had learned that vulnerability was a luxury she could never afford. One of the clearest signs of her guardedness was the throne room itself. When she entered, she did so with deliberate slowness, not out of vanity, but out of calculation. The distance between the doors and the throne gave her enough time to study every face in the crowd, to weigh intentions, to measure danger, to remind herself that she was the child of a mother who fell from grace and a father who could destroy anyone with a signature. Every step across that polished floor echoed her past the courtiers, saw a queen claiming her authority. Elizabeth felt a girl walking through memories she wished she could forget. Even her illness, still unnamed, still mysterious, seemed to intensify under the pressure of the throne. The faint dizziness, the tightness in her chest, the fleeting moments when her breath grew shallow, they returned stronger whenever the room was crowded, whenever voices grew loud, whenever she felt the eyes of dozens of powerful men watching her. She had learned as a child to hide these symptoms behind a calm expression. As queen, she perfected the act. When her heart raced, she rested a hand on her gown as though admiring the embroidery. When her breathing faltered, she paused as if giving a dramatic moment's silence. When her vision blurred, she blinked slowly, making it look intentional, queenly. Even no one in the council chamber suspected how hard she worked to stay steady. But the shadows knew. They always knew. There were nights when she lay awake in her royal bed, staring at the canopy overhead, remembering the terror of childhood mornings when a single mistake felt like a death sentence. Some fears linger long after they are reasonable. Some wounds leave trace even when healed, and some shadows never truly fade. One of her strongest memories, one she rarely spoke of, was a winter day when she was 8 years old. She had wandered into a corridor where two ladies whispered about her fate. They said the king regretted her existence, that she reminded him too much of the wife he wanted to forget, that she, a small girl in a simple dress, might never rise above her mother's shame. She froze in place, listening. Her throat tightened. Her chest ached. Her eyes filled with tears. She forced herself not to shed. That moment carved itself into her forever. Years later, when foreign princes sent proposals and ambassadors praised her beauty, she heard those whispers again, not literally, but in her memory, like an echo traveling through stone walls. She grew wary of flattery, because she had once overheard the cruelty that hid behind it. And so, her throne sheeny, golden, celebrated by the kingdom, was never a place of pure triumph for Elizabeth. It was a place where her childhood fears stood guard beside her, reminding her of every risk, every potential betrayal, every ghost that still walked the corridors of her life. But here is the remarkable part. Those shadows did not weaken her. They steeled her. They taught her caution, intelligence, patience. They shaped her into a ruler who did not trust blindly, who made decisions slowly, deliberately, and with a depth of understanding most monarchs lacked. Her past created her strength, even as it haunted her. And when she rose each morning to face the court, her illness hidden, her emotions guarded, her crown steady on her head, she did so, knowing that every choice she made carried the weight of a lifetime spent surviving the ruthless Tudor world that the shadows followed her. But she walked ahead anyway. The silent fear that grew after her mother's execution, long before Elizabeth Tudor wore the crown, long before she became the Virgin Queen. She lived with a fear so quiet and so deep that it never left her, not even in old age. It began on a single spring morning, when the bells of London rang not for celebration, but for execution. She was too young to understand the details, too innocent to grasp the politics, yet old enough to feel the cold tremor of danger ripple through the palace walls. Her mother was dead, executed by the king, executed by her own father. No one explained anything to the little red-haired girl who sat in a corner of the nursery, clutching a small wooden doll. But she overheard the whispers. She felt the tension in the air. She sensed that something monstrous had happened, something that would carve a crack into her heart that never fully healed. That morning, the world around her changed in ways she didn't have words for. The servants who once smiled at her now stepped cautiously, choosing each movement as if the walls themselves had ears. Some bowed too quickly. Others barely looked at her. Her governess seemed nervous, rushing her through lessons as if afraid to linger too long. Elizabeth didn't know why, but she sensed she had become dangerous to be near. Children don't need explanations to feel abandonment. They feel it in the pauses. They feel it in the silence. They feel it in the looks adults try not to show. Elizabeth felt it in every breath. The fear she carried from that day forward was in the wild, screaming fear of nightmares. It was quieter, heavier, like a stone dropped into the deepest part of a lake. It made no sound, yet it pulled everything downward. It settled in her bones, her heartbeat, her beliefs about the world. And from that fear grew a lifelong obsession with control. Because if her own mother could be taken away without warning, who else could she trust? And if a king's love was not enough to save a queen, what protection did a child have? She never forgot that lesson. No king was safe from fear. No queen was safe from betrayal. No daughter was ever safe from the decisions of powerful men. In the days after the execution, Elizabeth found herself drifting through the palace like a ghost. Rooms that once felt warm now felt vast and echoing. People spoke around her instead of to her. She caught fragments of conversations, words like treason, witchcraft, seduced the king, shame, disgrace. She didn't understand them, but she understood the tone, fear mixed with disgust. What she remembers most clearly is the sound of doors closing. Doors to her mother's chambers. Doors to rooms she used to play in. Doors to people who once treated her with affection. Each closing door taught her a lesson she carried all the way into the throne room. Any love that depends on power can disappear the moment that power shifts. She learned early not to cling too tightly to anyone. The palace tried to continue as if nothing had happened, but a child's heart can sense the truth better than any diplomat. Elizabeth sensed she was being erased gently, quietly, but unmistakably. Her title was stripped, her lineage questioned, her family narrowed down to a father who rarely visited, and a sister who watched her with suspicion. And then came the nightmares. At first, they were muffled screams, cold stone floors. But over time, they sharpened into images that woke her trembling. She dreamed of headless figures, of crowds screaming, of faceless men dragging her away. She dreamed of running, but never moving, of crying out, but no voice escaping her throat. No one comforted her. No one held her. No one told her she was safe. She wasn't sure she would have believed them anyway. During the years that followed, the fear planted itself deeper. It surfaced whenever she heard footsteps in the corridor late at night. It swelled when advisors argued behind closed doors. It tightened around her chest whenever the king raised his voice. And though she learned to hide it with remarkable skill, this silent fear shaped every corner of her personality. It made her observant. It made her cautious. It made her distrustful of sudden affection. It made her fiercely protective of her independence. Even as a child, she developed the habit of listening before speaking, of watching before reacting. She memorized the smallest details in a roomed placement of guards, the tone of voices, the shifts in expression. These survival instincts would one day define her reign, but back then, they were simply a shield against a world too uncertain to trust. One of her governesses once wrote that Elizabeth was quiet yet burning with thought. Another noted that the child watches everything as if preparing for something. They saw her intelligence, her sharp wit, her charm, but they missed the underlying truth. She wasn't preparing for greatness. She was preparing for danger. Years later, when she walked into her throne room as queen, that childhood vigilance came with her. She entered not as a ruler born to command, but as a survivor who had learned young that life could vanish with a whisper. Her secret illness, the fluttering heartbeat, the tightening chest, the dizzy spells often returned during the heaviest moments of court life. And though no one dared connect her symptoms to her past, Elizabeth herself understood. Fear does not disappear simply because a crown sits upon the head. It simply hides better. There were times, especially early in her reign, when she felt that old fear rise against soft, but overwhelming, familiar as an old song. It happened during her first audience as queen, when she walked through the great hall and felt dozens of eyes on her. It happened when foreign ambassadors questioned her legitimacy. It happened when loyalists of Mary Tudor doubted her right to rule. In each of those moments, her childhood returned to her not as memory, but as sensation. She felt 8 years old, again alone in a palace, uncertain of who would be taken from her next. But this chapter of her story holds something even more important: the way that silent fear shaped her choices about love. Romantic attention always made her uneasy, even when it came from men she cared for. She understood too well the cost of trusting the wrong person. She understood the danger of surrendering her independence, and she understood, perhaps better than any monarch in history, that vulnerability could be weaponized. If a king could sever the head of a wife, then what could a husband do to a queen? That question never left her. Some say Elizabeth rejected marriage for political reasons. Others say she feared childbirth. Still others claim she was simply too devoted to her country. But beneath all those explanations lay a quieter truth. She feared giving anyone the same power over her that her father had held over her mother. That fear began the moment the sword fell on Tower Green. It deepened with every whisper she overheard. It matured with every betrayal she saw in court, and one day it walked beside her into the throne room, fully grown, fully formed, fully part of the woman she had become. Her mother's execution didn't just take a parent from her. It carved the shape of her future. It defined the queen she would be. It molded the loneliness she chose. It created the legend historians still debate. Elizabeth Tudor rose above her. But she never outran it. The silent fear stayed with her, just beneath the surface, waiting in the space between her heartbeat and her breath, and it would continue shaping her story as she stepped deeper into the dangerous world of Tudor politics, where shadows never stopped following her. The illness that whispered through the Tudor court, long before Elizabeth Tudor became a symbol of strength, long before she stood unshaken before ambassadors and armies. There was something far more fragile whispering through the corridors around Haran. Illness no one dared name, yet everyone quietly noticed. It didn't announce itself with dramatic collapse or fevered cries. No, Elizabeth's illness was subtle, private, and strangely loyal. It appeared in moments of tension, before difficult conversations, or when memory caught her off guard. It arrived like a faint tremor beneath her ribs, a quick flutter in her chest, or a tightening in her breath that made her pause mid. Court never knew the full truth, but they felt something. They saw it in the way she touched her chest as if steadying herself. They saw it in the stillness that overtook her right before she regained absolute control. They saw it in her eyes, sharp, alert, but shadowed by something she refused to speak of. Her illness didn't cripple her. It whispered, and the Tudor court, full of rumors, full of fear, listened. Elizabeth first noticed it during her girlhood. In the years after her mother's execution, she would be sitting in a room, head bent over a book, when suddenly her breath would shorten. The air would feel thick, heavy, unwilling to move. Her pulse would race, as if trying to outrun something, but nothing around her had changed. It was her body, remembering fear, long after the danger had passed. Back then, she thought it was simply part of growing up. Girls had strange phases, and the palace doctors were quick to dismiss her symptoms as nerves, imagination, or a humoral imbalance, their convenient explanation for anything they couldn't understand. They prescribed herbal teas, rest, and whispered prayers to balance her delicate nature. But Elizabeth knew her nature better than they did. She wasn't delicate. She was simply living with something she didn't know how to name. By the time she reached adolescence, the illness had grown more complicated. Moments of pressure, sudden, loud voices, unexpected confrontations, or reminders of past disregard. That familiar tightening. Once, during a tense visit from her father, she felt the room spin just as Henry VIII fixed his cold gaze on her. She gripped the edge of her skirt to anchor herself, forcing her body to appear calm. She learned early that showing weakness in the Tudor court was as dangerous as treason, so she became an expert at hiding it, standing tall even when her heart stumbled, speaking steadily even when her breath faltered, smiling faintly even when her chest felt like it was being pressed by invisible hands. To the world, she looked composed, logical, brilliantly sharp. Inside, she sometimes felt the quiet thrum of panic rising, like a tide she had to keep from reaching the shore. When she became queen, the court assumed she would free herself from burdens. What they did not understand was that the throne was a burden, a golden one, a heavy one, and one that pressed exactly where her childhood wounds still lived. Her illness whispered louder in the months following her coronation. Sometimes it struck while she stood before the Privy Council, their eyes fixed on her every word. The room would feel suddenly too narrow, the air too thin. Her pulse would quicken beneath her collar, reminding her of old fears she had never fully untangled. She would place one hand lightly on the table, not to lean, but to steady the world around her. The men saw a queen pausing for a fete. They never knew she was fighting to control her breath. Sometimes it came during tense moments with ambassadors. She would feel her heartbeat flutter violently, too fast, too soft, too uncertain, like a trapped bird inside her chest. She learned to hide it behind a thoughtful look, a graceful turn of her wrist. Slow inhale, disguised as contemplation. Her illness never defeated her, but it marked her, it shaped her, it became part of her private world she never invited anyone into, not even the men she trusted most. There were whispers among the ladies of her chamber. They noticed that she often needed a moment alone before big decisions. They noticed her preference for smaller gatherings rather than crowded rooms where noise and chaos made her symptoms harder to hide. They noticed the way she retreated into silence when the pressure grew too great. But they also noticed something else: her composure. Elizabeth had a gift for turning her fragility into a kind of mystique. When others might panic, she remained eerily calm. When her chest tightened, she slowed her speech, creating a measured rhythm that mesmerized those listening. When fear made her breath shallow, she compensated by lowering her voice, making every word sound deliberate and powerful. People believed she was born with regal poise. They never guessed it was a survival strategy, perfected since childhood. Physicians tried to intervene, of course. Tudor doctors were eager to treat their queen, eager to claim credit for curing an ailment they did not understand. They offered potions made of lavender, mint, rose petals, and crushed pearls. They recommended bloodletting, which Elizabeth refused. They suggested prayer, meditation, and warm baths infused with herbs. None of it made a difference, because the illness lived deeper than they could reach. Was it an arrhythmia, a form of anxiety forged by trauma, an inherited condition? Historians still debate it. But the truth was simpler and far more personal. Elizabeth's body remembered what her mind tried to forget. Fear leaves fingerprints. Trauma leaves echoes. And the child who once froze upon hearing her mother's fate had grown into a queen whose heartbeat still carried that memory. One of the most striking moments happened during a state banquet in her early reign. The hall was crowded, hot with candle smoke, humming with music and chatter. Elizabeth sat at the head of the long table, jewels glinting, gown, shimmering, the embodiment of royal power. But beneath that display, something inside her faltered. Her vision blurred. Her breath shortened. Her chest tightened painfully. She placed her hand over her heart, not dramatically, but gently. The gesture as admiration for a musician performing nearby. One of her ladies leaned close and quietly asked if she wished to retire. Elizabeth shook her head. If she left, rumors would explode within minutes. If she stayed, she might faint. But if she remained calm, if she controlled her breath, slowed her heartbeat, steadied her thoughts, she could survive it. So she did. For the next 20 minutes, she sat perfectly still, every muscle tight with effort, every inhale a battle against dizziness. No one knew, no one saw, and when the moment passed, she simply raised her goblet and continued the evening, as if nothing had happened. That banquet became the first of many nights where Elizabeth proved that strength did not mean being unbroken. It meant holding your cracks with enough grace that no one dared question your brilliance. The illness followed her into diplomacy as well. Foreign princes sent marriage proposals. Each proposal came with pressure, and pressure triggered her symptoms more than anything else. Marriage meant vulnerability. Marriage meant surrendering control. Marriage meant trusting someone deeply enough to share the truth she hid from the world. Her chest tightened at the thought. She declined proposal after proposal, not just for political reasons, but because her illness reacted violently whenever she imagined giving another person power over her life, her body, her secrets. And perhaps that was the real reason she became the Virgin Queen. Not because she lacked desire, not because she valued chastity, but because her illness, born from trauma, made intimacy feel dangerous in ways she could never explain. The whispers in the Tudor court continued for decades. Some said she had a heart condition. Some said she had fits. Some said she had inherited her mother's nervous temperament. Others claimed witchcraft. Naturally, Tudor England loved a dramatic lie. But the truth was locked inside Elizabeth herself. She never named the illness. She never confessed its presence. She never allowed it to define her. Instead, she learned to rule alongside it, listening to its whispers, managing its waves, navigating its sudden storms with the composure of a queen who had learned long ago that survival required silence. And as she stepped deeper into her reign, one thing became clear. The illness that whispered through the Tudor court did not weaken Elizabeth. Tudor, it sharpened her. It taught her restraint, it shaped her. Caution that. It reminded her Rita power was fragile. Breath was precious. And fear was something even queens could not ignore. But she walked forward anyway, and the world followed her. Why every suitor saw a crown, but Elizabeth saw a threat. When Elizabeth Tudor stepped into the cold light of power, she did so surrounded by men who claimed they adored her, yet each one carried ambitions that stretched far beyond romance. To the world, she was the most eligible woman alive, a queen whose crown glittered brighter than any jewel Europe could offer. But to Elizabeth herself, every hopeful smile looked like a hand reaching for something she wasn't ready to surrender. Marriage, for her, had never been a simple matter of affection. It was a battlefield dressed in silk, and she, shaped by years of betrayal and loss, knew exactly how deeply such alliances could wound. from the moment she became queen. Ambassadors scribbled reports describing her beauty, her intelligence, her laughter that warmed the halls of Whitehall. But beneath that laughter was calculation. Beneath the sparkle in her eyes lived a quiet suspicion, an instinct sharpened by years trapped between powerful men who seemed to lose their humanity whenever the crown was placed within reach. And so, while the suitors saw a throne that could strengthen their kingdoms, Elizabeth saw something else entirely, a danger disguised as devotion. The first wave of offers began almost immediately after her coronation. Letters arrived sealed with wax, each bearing titles greater than the last: dukes, princes, foreign lords, with armies behind them and promises lined with gold. They wrote poems about her, compared her eyes to dawn and her hair to spun copper. But Elizabeth read their letters not as love notes, but as military strategies. Every offer was a calculation. Every vow of loyalty was a negotiation. Every flirtation was a potential collapse of England's fragile independence. She had watched her father, Henry VIII, cast wives aside like broken tools whenever they failed to meet his shifting expectations. She had seen her half-sister marry a Spanish prince, and lose the support of her people overnight. And she remembered her mother, whose marriage, for all its passion and purpose, ended beneath a blade. Elizabeth knew the truth that most women of her time were never allowed to speak aloud. Marriage could destroy a woman long before illness or war ever touched her. But for a queen, the danger was even sharper. Her body was not truly her own. A husband would not just take her hand, he would take the throne by proximity, influence, or sheer audacity. To Elizabeth, love was never simply love. It was power, and power demanded caution. Yet she played the game with extraordinary grace. She flirted, but lightly. She entertained proposals, but never long enough to let hope take root. She danced with suitors in gilded halls, but always kept an emotional distance wide enough to protect both her heart and her crown. Foreign observers marveled at her ability to make a man feel like he stood inches from victory while never actually letting him step across the line. Some called it manipulation. Others called it brilliance. But for Elizabeth, it was survival. At court, she often found herself surrounded by men whose smiles were too sweet, their compliments too polished. They spoke of unity and alliance, but the glint in their eyes betrayed a deeper hunger, one for control, for influence, for the chance to reshape England in their own image. Elizabeth sensed it instantly. She had grown up studying people the way scholars studied ancient texts, and behind every charming nobleman she met, she recognized the same pattern: admiration on the surface, ambition lurking just beneath stot. To love such men was to invite danger. To marry them was to hand them the keys to her kingdom. That she could never allow. There was, of course, one exception, or at least the closest she ever came to an exception: Robert Dudley. To nearly every other man in England, Elizabeth presented a wall of bright, graceful distance. To Dudley, she allowed a little more warmth. The court whispered endlessly about them, weaving rumors thick enough to darken the very ceilings of Whitehall. Dudley was handsome, loyal, and knew Elizabeth's childhood scars better than any other man alive. But even he did not escape her caution. Even with him, the crown forced a distance. Marriage to Dudley might have been a personal comfort, but politically, it could have destroyed her. Every suitor was either too foreign or too familiar, too ambitious or too influential, too beloved by England or too despised by it. There was always something, always at risk, and Elizabeth had learned too young that the smallest risk, once ignored, could unravel a life entirely. Still, the longing simmered quietly beneath her royal composure. She watched other women at court marry, bear children, laugh freely in gardens and great halls. Elizabeth envied them sometimes. The simplicity, the freedom from constant scrutiny, the ability to be vulnerable without fear of losing a nation. But whenever envy crept in, she reminded herself of the truth. History was filled with queens undone by their husbands. England needed strength, not softness, and she feared that marriage might demand a kind of surrender she could never afford. So she chose solitude, not because she wished to be alone, but because she refused to be a pawn. As the years passed, Elizabeth mastered the art of balancing hope and denial. Suitors continued to send lavish gifts, portraits, and carefully worded letters. Some traveled across oceans to meet her, others spent fortunes trying to win even a moment of her attention. But she met each one with the same poised, restraint kind enough to keep them friendly, distant enough to keep them powerless. Behind closed doors, though, she carried the weight of that choice. Late at night, when the court fell silent, and only the soft crackle of fire kept her company, she wondered what her life might have been if she were simply Elizabeth, the woman not. Elizabeth Regina, the sovereign. She wondered what it would feel like to trust without fear, to love without strategy, to rest without suspicion. But dawn always came, and with it, the responsibilities she could not escape. So Elizabeth learned to steady her heart the same way she steadied her nation firmly, cautiously, and always with the understanding that weakness invited danger. Her suitors saw a queen who illuminated every room she entered. She saw men who could take everything she had fought to protect. And in that quiet, painful difference, her loneliness took root. This was the burden of her crown, and it was one she bore with grace, even as it kept her forever standing on the edge between affection and fear. She would not marry because she understood what others did not. Her greatest strength was the independence that frightened so many of the men who claimed to love her. And in the years to come, that choice would shape not just her life, but the destiny of an entire kingdom. The burden of a body that did not always obey its queen. For all the grandeur that surrounded Queen ElizabethI, gold-threaded gowns, the jeweled collars, the thunderous applause of her subjects, there was one truth she could never escape. Her body, despite its royal presentation, was fragile in ways no throne could protect. The world saw a queen who seemed carved from steel, a woman whose voice could still a room and whose presence could bend nations toward peace or war. But behind the velvet curtains, Elizabeth lived with a body that betrayed her at the most inconvenient, most terrifying moments, and nothing unnerved her more than the unpredictability of her own flesh. Illness had always hovered around her life, like a silent observer. Even in childhood, she had been a sickly girl, frail under stress, susceptible to fevers that rose with alarming speed. As queen, her health was still a private battlefield, one she fought long after the candles were extinguished and the laughter of the court faded into night. It was not a single disease, not one clean diagnosis. It was something vaguer, more unsettling, a weakness that waxed and waned, a trembling in her hands after long counsels, sudden waves of exhaustion that swept through her like cold wind through a chapel. Occasionally, Sharp pains spiraled through her side, leaving her breathless for minutes at a time. She hid these episodes with a mastery born from fear. England could tolerate many things: wars, rebellions, intrigue. But a weak monarch, that was a threat no nation could afford. The burden began early in her reign. During long days of state business, Elizabeth would sometimes feel a spinning sensation beneath her ribs, as if her body was reminding her of the limits she refused to acknowledge. She held herself upright anyway, maintaining her regal posture even when her vision blurred at the edges. Courtiers believed she never tired. Advisors believed she never faltered. But behind closed doors, her lady waiting saw the truth. Some nights she leaned heavily on the arm of a trusted attendant, her steps small and careful. Other nights she would collapse onto a cushioned chair, breath tight, face pale beneath the layers of white lead makeup she wore. She would wait, silent and still, for the pain to ebb. Yet she always insisted this weakness remain a secret. A queen's body belonged not to herself, but to her country. And a flawed body meant a flawed kingdom. Elizabeth knew that if foreign rulers learned of her physical vulnerabilities, they would see opportunity. They would send more suitors, more spies, more threats. They would assume England needed a stronger figure, perhaps. A husband who could guide her. She refused to let that happen. Her body might shake, but the illusion of strength must never. The Elizabethan court, of course, was not blind. Rumors moved quickly in the palace, whispers of fainting spells, of sudden retreats to her private chambers, of long absences from festivities. But rumor was manageable. Truth was not. So Elizabeth constructed a careful routine. She appeared in public when she felt strongest. She limited her movements when the weakness returned. She surrounded herself with loyal women who understood that silence was as much a duty as service. Still, the fear lingered. She hated how her hands sometimes trembled before she delivered a speech. She hated the way cold weather aggravated the pain in her joints. She hated how she occasionally struggled to rise from her chair after hours of counsel, forcing her body into stillness so no one would notice the strain. And most of all, she hated the reminder that no amount of power could negotiate with the body she inhabited. Those closest to her knew her struggle most intimately. Lady Blanche Parry, who had served Elizabeth's childhood, recognized the warning signs long before the Queen admitted them. She could sense when Elizabeth's energy dimmed, her voice grew softer, her movements slower, her gaze more distant. Blanche worried quietly, especially during the long winters, when illness crept through the palace like a thief. But Elizabeth always brushed aside concerns with a sharp look or a wry smile. "My body obeys well enough," she would say. "My kingdom demands more than a single weakness." Her stubbornness was legendary, but it came with a price. On several occasions, illness struck with a force that shook even her most loyal servants. Once, after a fever that left her bedridden for days, she attempted to rise before she was ready. Blanche recalled the moment her queen's knees buckled, and she caught her just before she collapsed. The queen had whispered, breathless, "Do not speak of this." Blanche never did. Still, moments like these reminded those around her that Elizabeth lived on a thin, wavering line between iron will and physical fragility. The deeper fear, though the fear Elizabeth never voiced, was that her illness might reveal itself during a moment of political tension. If she faltered in front of an ambassador, it could shift international alliances. If she collapsed during council, It might spark rumors of death or succession. England was always watching her, always weighing her strength, always searching for cracks. And she, in turn, learned to hide her weaknesses with theatrical skill. When her body felt unsteady, she relied on composure. When her breath grew short, she paused gracefully, as though considering her next words. When pain flickered beneath her ribs, she masked it with a smile. Years of practice made the disguise flawless. But the truth lingered beneath the performance. A monarch was expected to be unbreakable. A woman was expected to be fragile. Elizabeth lived in the tension between both. Her body obeyed neither expectation completely. Sometimes, at night, after the palace had quieted into sleep, Elizabeth allowed herself a moment of honesty. She would sit before her mirror, the candlelight flickering across her face, and feel the weight of her frailties. She would remove her heavy wig, wipe away the makeup that concealed how pale she had become, and simply breathe. It was in these moments and guarded, unseen that she felt most vulnerable. Her reflection revealed the truth she hid from the world. A woman exhausted by the constant demands placed on her, terrified that someday her body might fail at the exact moment her kingdom needed her most. She feared illness, not because of the pain it caused, but because of the power it threatened to expose. To fall ill was to lose control. And control was the foundation of her reign. The paradox was cruel. The stronger England grew under her rule. The more she pushed her body beyond its limits, her spirit drove her forward, but her physical strength lagged behind. She knew that a misstep could undo decades of work, that a fainting spell could embolden her enemies, that a prolonged sickness could unleash chaos upon her people. So she carried her burden quietly. She ruled through discomfort. She smiled through pain. She walked through corridors, while her heart raced with dizziness. She stood before crowds, while her muscles trembled beneath her gown. Her body did not always obey her, but her will did, and in the balance between these two forces, Elizabeth forged the myth that would outlive her, the myth of the Virgin Queen. Unshakable, untouchable, almost divine. What history rarely mentions is how much effort it took to keep that illusion alive, because beneath the crown was a woman fighting a daily battle against weakness, pretending each morning that she had slept soundly, pretending each evening that the strain had not worn her thin. She was a sovereign who ruled millions, yet privately feared the one thing she could not command: the quiet, unpredictable rebellion of her own body. And in the years ahead, this burden would only grow heavier, shaping her decisions, her alliances, and the shadows she chose to navigate alone. A palace filled with advisors, yet empty of true companionship. For most people, loneliness is a quiet ache that settles in the corners of an empty room. For Elizabeth Tudor, loneliness echoed across palaces. Whitehall, Richmond, Greenwich residence glittered with life, humming with nobles, guards, servants, ambassadors, musicians, scholars, and advisors. Hundreds of people greeted her each morning. Thousands depended on her each year. And yet, in all the noise, Elizabeth remained deeply, painfully alone. A queen could command armies, but she could not command sincerity. Not in a world where everyone stood to gain something from her favor. Power surrounded her, yes, but companionship, that was a far rarer luxury. The palace was always busy, endless footsteps down polished corridors, messengers darting through archways, council members arguing in low voices. At every hour of the day, someone needed her signature, her approval, her decision. Her throne was less a seat than a workstation, one that consumed every bit of her time and energy. But in all the commotion, Elizabeth recognized the truth that settled over her like a winter frost. The people around her served her crown, not her heart. Her advisors, Cecil, Walsingham, Bacon, were brilliant men, absolutely essential to England's rising power. But they were strategists first, companions second. Their conversations with her were weighed, measured, filtered through political necessity. Every request they made, every opinion they offered, carried a hidden consequence. They were loyal, but not intimate, respectful, but not emotionally close, but never fully genuine. Elizabeth knew how their eyes flicked toward the throne behind her as they spoke, as even in private. They could not separate the woman from the monarch. She envied them in moments, how freely they moved, how easily they spoke to one another, how they could simply be, without the constant weight of expectation. She did not have that luxury, not once she became queen. In the evenings, when the court gathered for feasts or dances, Elizabeth often found herself surrounded by laughter that did not quite reach her. Nobles toasted to her health, musicians played soft ballads, and servants refilled goblets with wine. The great halls looked warm, alive, but the warmth rarely touched her. She understood why. Every smile offered to her was exaggerated. Every compliment carried an agenda. Every joyful bow or curtsy hid a calculation. People didn't speak to Elizabeth, the woman. They spoke to Elizabeth, the opportunity. They wanted titles. They wanted influence. They wanted their families elevated, their lands protected, their fortunes secured. Even friendship in the court was a delicate thing. If someone grew too close to her, others became suspicious. If someone drifted away, rumors spread like brush fire. Nothing was simple, not even choosing who could stand beside her at a gathering. The court was a maze, brightly lit, beautifully decorated, but full of shadows. Her ladies in waiting came closest to offering something more human. They shared her daily routines, helped her dress, brushed her hair, whispered comfort during exhausting days. Some of them, Blanche Perry, let us know Catherine Ashley had known her since childhood or adolescence. Yet even with them, boundaries existed like invisible walls. They were loyal, but the hierarchy was absolute. Their lives were tied to her moods, her favor, her political position. Even their affection included a sense of caution. Elizabeth could trust them with tasks, with routine, with silence, yet not with the deepest cracks of her heart, not the fear she felt during sudden bouts of illness, not the loneliness she buried beneath her elaborate gowns, not the memories of childhood trauma that still followed her into restless sleep. A queen could confess nothing, not without consequences. So she kept her thoughts folded inside herself, like sealed lettuce delivered dots sometimes. Late at night, she would walk alone through the long galleries of her palace, her footsteps soft against the wooden floors. Her torch cast faint shadows that stretched along the walls, flickering like ghosts of people she once loved. She thought often of her mother, Anne Boleyn, whose execution had carved a permanent wound in her heart. She thought of her brother Edward, her sister Mary, of friends lost to illness, politics, or betrayal. And in those quiet hallways, the absence of genuine companionship felt almost physical, like a hollow space beneath her ribs. It was not that she lacked people. It was that she lacked people who saw her. Her advisors saw her as a strategist. Her subjects saw her as a symbol. Foreign ambassadors saw her as a bargaining chip or potential bride. Her ladies saw her as a duty. Her suitors saw her as a prize. But very few saw her as Elizabeth, the girl who grew up frightened and uncertain, the woman who carried secret illnesses, the human being who wanted laughter without suspicion, conversation without caution, presence without performance. It is a strange thing, she often thought, to be surrounded by thousands and yet unseen by all of them. Still, Elizabeth was not bitter. She accepted this solitude as part of her position, a necessary sacrifice. During council meetings, she leaned into her intelligence, not her vulnerability. She debated fiercely, commanded respect, outmaneuvered foreign powers with sharp wit and sharper observation. But when the advisors retired for the evening and the great doors of the council chamber closed behind them, she remained alone with the documents on her desk. The weight of the crown pressed hardest when no one was watching. She would sit there for long stretches of time, listening to the crackle of the fireplace, feeling the faint ache in her chest where exhaustion settled. This is what it meant to rule alone. This was the price. Even Robert Dudley, the closest person to warmth in her life, could not fill the emptiness entirely. He brought laughter, yes, a sense of youth she rarely allowed herself, moments of light that eased the heaviness she carried. But even with Dudley, the boundary stood. Marriage was impossible. Public affection was impossible. Total trust was impossible. There were too many eyes watching. Too many rival families ready to twist the relationship into scandal. Too many political risks. So, even her most meaningful connection came with limitations that tightened around her like a corset. Dudley could warm her heart, but he could not ease her isolation. Elizabeth understood, perhaps more clearly than any monarch before her, that a ruler's life was not built for true companionship. Authority created distance. Fear created silence. Expectation created walls. She became a master at managing people, but a novice at relying on them. And so, the palace remained both her kingdom and her cage. By day, she commanded armies and shaped England's destiny. By night, she sat in chambers filled with opulence, but void of intimacy. The contrast was striking, and painful, and deeply human. Yet, it was exactly this solitude, this emotional distance that sharpened the edge of her strength. A queen who trusted. To Iseli risked falling too quickly. Elizabeth knew that lesson all too well from watching others lose their thrones, their reputations, their lives. So she turned loneliness into discipline, emptiness into focus, isolation into resolve. If companionship was a luxury she could not afford, then she would rule without it. History would call her the Virgin Queen, the Gloriana, the monarch who needed no one. But the truth, quiet truth she carried behind her eyes was that she did not choose loneliness entirely. Some of it was chosen, some of it was imposed, some of it simply happened, and all of it shaped the woman England came to worship. Because behind the golden dresses and the dazzling speeches was a soul that ached quietly for something simple, a voice to trust, a presence to lean on, a companion who wanted nothing from her but her. Yet in a palace overflowing with people, such a person could not be found. How political marriage became a danger she refused to embrace. The idea of marriage had always hovered around Elizabeth Tudor, like a persistent shadow in expectation. The world pressed upon her long before she even wore the crown. From the moment she stepped onto the throne in 1558, statesmen, diplomats, and foreign rulers treated her singleness as a problem to be solved, an empty space that needed filling. But to Elizabeth, that empty space was not a void. It was freedom thin, fragile, and constantly threatened in the great chambers of Whitehall. Her counselors liked to pretend the matter was simple. "Your Majesty must marry," William Cecil would say, with that careful, grounded tone he used only when he was worried. For the succession, for stability, for England's future. And in that quiet but unyielding way of hers, Elizabeth would nod, even smile, while giving nothing away. She knew what they feared, that her reign would end with the kingdom torn apart again by rival claims. She understood their logic. But logic had never saved a Tudor from the dangers hidden inside a marriage bed. For Elizabeth, matrimony was not the romantic promise sung in ballads. It was a political cage, one she had watched consume nearly everyone she loved. Marriage had stolen her mother and replaced her with a ghost. Marriage had turned her father, a man who once wrote poetry, into a judge, executioner, and tyrant. Marriage had plunged England into a violent spiral of succession crises that she had spent her whole childhood navigating like a labyrinth built by fate itself. She had seen the cost with her own eyes, and the crown on her head had only sharpened her caution. Every suitor who approached her, from the silver-tongued courtiers of Spain to the elegant princes of France, carried a hidden weapon disguised as a wedding proposal. Marriage wasn't only about alliance. It was about control. Whoever married Elizabeth would not be marrying a woman. They would be marrying England. And she understood too well what powerful men did with things they believed they owned. Still, the proposals flooded. In that, foreign ambassadors spoke of the Archduke Charles of Austria with a kind of reverent admiration reserved for saints and victorious generals. They promised charm, devotion, and an unshakable Catholic loyalty that made half her privy council salivate and the other half tighten their fists. Marrying him might have calmed Europe or ignited it. The French sent polished noblemen who bowed low, kissed her hand, and made their offers sound like poetry wrapped in diplomacy. England's merchants loved the idea of French trade. England's Protestants hated the idea of French influence. The country had split itself a dozen ways before she even read the letters. And yet, beneath all the ceremony, Elizabeth sensed the same hunger in every man who sought her hand. A crown glittered behind their eyes. A throne shimmered beneath their words. They did not love her. They coveted the power that would come with standing at her side. She could feel it, like a pulse under their courteous compliments. But there was one suitor who did not rest neatly on either side of that line between safety and danger. Robert Dudley. His presence tugged at her thoughts more sharply than she ever admitted aloud. Where foreign princes offered alliances, Dudley offered something more unsettling: familiarity. He knew her laugh, her temper, her mind. He could match her sharpness with his own. And for a queen who lived her life behind layers of caution and ceremony, that kind of closeness was both intoxicating and perilous. The whispers around the court grew so loud they began to seep into Europe. Ambassadors reported scandal. Enemies predicted instability. Friends warned her in gentle phrases disguised as counsel. Elizabeth understood the threat without anyone speaking it aloud. If she married Dudley, half the kingdom would see her not as a sovereign choosing a partner, but as a woman surrendering power to a courtier. And the moment the perception of power slipped, even slightly, England's enemies, foreign and domestic, would pounce. So she hardened her heart, the way she had learned to do long ago. She turned marriage into a performance, a dazzling game she controlled with flawless precision. She let suitors hope, but never enough. She let alliances dangle, but never settle. She spoke in riddles that charmed kings, yet told them nothing. She became the queen who might marry anyone, and therefore married no one. But the truth beneath her carefully crafted image was far more vulnerable. At night, when the palace quieted and the candles burned low, she sometimes wondered if she had chosen caution over comfort. She wondered if keeping England safe meant condemning herself to a life spent in guarded solitude. She wondered if refusing to marry made her stronger or simply lonelier. But dawn always hardened those thoughts back into resolve. The crown demanded sacrifices, and she had learned long ago that her own happiness would be the first offering. Her advisors didn't understand. Not completely. They saw her reluctance as strategic, clever, frustrating, and occasionally exasperating. They never saw the memory of a young girl watching her mother's head fall beneath a sword. They never felt the echo of the tower walls where she had once been imprisoned on suspicion of treason simply for being a Tudor. They never carried the fear that marriage, for a woman in her position, was not merely a partnership, it was a slow tightening of chains. Still, pressure grew. In Europe, kings and emperors wondered aloud if she was stalling for advantage. In England, nobles debated the succession at dinners and whispered in corridors as though she could not hear them. Even those who adored her sometimes doubted her resolve. But Elizabeth had made up her mind long before the world began doubting it for her. She would not place her body, her crown, or her country into the hands of any man who believed he could command her. She would rule alone, not because she lacked suitors, but because she refused to gamble England's future on marriage's dangerous promises. And yet, even as she held firm, the world around her shifted. Europe bristled with tension. England's religious fractures deepened, and the question of her succession loomed larger with each passing year, a shadow that stretched from her private chambers to the farthest edges of her realm. It was becoming clear that refusing to marry would not shield her forever. If anything, it was drawing new dangers toward her. Dangers she had not yet allowed herself to confront. Dangers that would soon force her to face not just the politics outside her palace walls, but the vulnerabilities she kept buried deep within them. Robert Dudley, the one man who came close, yet never close enough. In the gilded corridors of Elizabeth's court, few names carried the weight and quiet promise that Robert Dudley's did. He was not merely a favored courtier or a trusted advisor. To many, he appeared almost inseparable from the Queen herself. From the moment he returned from the battlefield, bearing both valor and scars, Elizabeth's eyes seemed to linger on him longer than was deemed proper for a monarch. Yet, This closeness was as precarious as a candle flame in a drafty hall. Elizabeth, the sovereign of England, understood that intimacy was a luxury that could be weaponized against her, and love a dangerous, uncontrollable fire. Dudley was charming, witty, and astutely aware of courtly dynamics. Every step he took within the palace walls was measured, calculated, and seemingly directed toward drawing the Queen's attention without crossing the invisible lines of propriety. He carried himself with a confidence that came from knowing his own value. Yet beneath that veneer lay a restless desire to be more than a confidant. To Dudley, Elizabeth was not just a ruler to admire. She was the woman who haunted his thoughts, whose laughter could lift him above the monotony of court life, and whose gaze alone could make him feel both triumphant and exposed. However, Elizabeth had long ago learned that affection was a double-edged sword. Every bond she formed risked betrayal, ambition, or scandal. Even Dudley, loyal and steadfast as he appeared, could not escape the delicate balance that she maintained between her heart and her crown. Rumors festered through the halls, whispers that Dudley harbored ambitions that extended beyond friendship, that he saw her not only as a queen, but as a prize. For Elizabeth, these murmurs were not idle gossip, they were warnings etched into the very architecture of her mind. To trust fully was to endanger herself, and perhaps the stability of her reign. Their companionship, therefore, was marked by a peculiar dance. Publicly, Dudley bowed and spoke in deferential tones, always careful to acknowledge Elizabeth's sovereignty. Privately, their conversations wandered into laughter, shared memories, and the quiet exploration of thoughts and emotions that few others could access. Yet, even in these private moments, Elizabeth maintained a wall of silent acknowledgement that desire must always be tempered by prudence. She cherished Dudley's presence but would never let it compromise the careful image she projected to the world, that of the Virgin Queen, untouchable, unyielding, and alone in her sovereignty. Dudley's frustration, though never openly displayed, was palpable to those who knew him well. He longed for more than fleeting glances and whispered confidences. He imagined a life beside Elizabeth, not only as her advisor, but as her companion, perhaps even her partner. Yet he understood, perhaps better than anyone, that her crown was a barrier no man could dismantle, no matter the depth of his devotion. Every gesture of affection, every subtle sign of favor, was tempered by the invisible weight of duty and the relentless expectations of a nation that watched Elizabeth as both monarch and legend. Despite these constraints, Dudley never ceased to try. He became attuned to the rhythms of Elizabeth's moods, the subtle shifts in her expression that signaled both approval and warning. He learned to navigate the intricate web of politics and propriety, knowing that a single misstep could unravel the fragile connection he maintained with the Queen. And yet, even as he mastered this delicate art, he could never bridge the gap entirely. He could be her friend, her confidant, perhaps the closest anyone could ever hope to be, but never enough to occupy the space Elizabeth reserved solely for herself. Elizabeth's affection for Dudley, however, was genuine. She valued his counsel, admired his courage, and found solace in his presence amid the isolation that her position demanded. But affection was different from love in the eyes of a queen. It was a bond that brought warmth without vulnerability, comfort without danger. Dudley's closeness reminded her of what she had sacrificed for power, of the loneliness that came with being the symbol of a nation. And while she treasured these moments, she knew that the line between trust and peril was a line that even Dudley, for all his insight, could never cross. In the end, their relationship was defined by what it could not become. Dudley's devotion remained steadfast, but Elizabeth's crown and her secrets created a chasm that neither charm nor loyalty could bridge. The queen who commanded armies, negotiated treaties, and faced plots with unflinching resolve still carried within her a private understanding that some closeness, however tempting, was forbidden. Robert Dudley had come as close as anyone ever would, but the queen, in her quiet wisdom, ensured that he never ventured too far. Their story was one of proximity and restraint, of desire and discretion, of human longing entangled with the burdens of rule. It revealed not only the cost of power but the careful architecture of a queen's heart, where affection was permitted, yet true intimacy remained forever out of reach. In the halls of Whitehall, in the private chambers of Elizabeth's mind, Dudley lingered close enough to touch, yet never close enough to claim what he sought most: the unguarded love of a queen who had chosen her crown over companionship. A mysterious weakness that struck at the worst possible moments. Even a queen as commanding as Elizabeth I was not immune to the frailties of the human body. Beneath the elaborate gowns, jeweled collars, and the unyielding mask of regal composure, there existed a vulnerability that few could see, yet one that shaped her reign as much as any political maneuver or military campaign. To the outside world, she appeared invincible, her voice clear, her posture upright, her decisions sharp and decisive. But those closest to her were painfully aware of moments when an invisible weakness would creep in, striking at times when the eyes of England and, often Europe, were fixed upon her. Elizabeth's mysterious malady manifested in subtle but insidious ways: a sudden dizziness while standing on the throne to address Parliament, an unexplainable fatigue during crucial council meetings, or a throbbing pain that made the simple act of walking down a palace corridor feel like an ordeal. Historians have debated what caused these episodes. Some suggest a chronic illness, perhaps anemia or an autoimmune disorder. Others believe it was the lasting psychological toll of trauma experienced in her youth. Whatever the root, the impact was undeniable, and Elizabeth herself learned early that this weakness could never be revealed openly. To do so would be to invite suspicion, to hint at vulnerability that foreign powers, ambitious nobles, or domestic rivals could exploit. The unpredictability of these episodes made them especially dangerous. Often, they struck at pivotal moments: a coronation ceremony, a council debate, or during negotiations with ambassadors from Spain and France. On one particularly tense occasion, a subtle swoon overtook her as she received envoys from the French court. The hall, grand and ornate, seemed to shrink around her as the color drained from her face. Courtiers whispered behind fans and tapestries, eyes darting nervously between her and Dudley, who had been sent ahead to assist. Elizabeth, ever aware of the perception of power, clenched her fists behind the thick folds of her sleeves, forcing her legs to support her. Teeth gritted against the rising wave of weakness. The danger, she understood, was not only in the illness itself, but in what her subjects and foreign dignitaries might infer. A momentary falter could be interpreted as hesitation, indecision, or worse, a crack in the facade of a sovereign who ruled with an iron will. This mysterious affliction also carried with it a psychological weight that compounded its physical symptoms. Elizabeth had grown up in a world where every slight, every misstep could mean death. The execution of her mother, the imprisonment under her sister Mary, and the constant plots surrounding her court taught her that appearances were as vital as any sword or shield. To be physically weakened even for a moment was to risk not only embarrassment, but the destabilization of her authority. In response, Elizabeth developed an almost instinctual strategy. She concealed her symptoms, adapted her schedule, and trained her mind to project control even when her body threatened to betray her. At times, the queen relied on rituals and subtle adjustments to manage the onset of weakness. A glass of spiced wine, the careful arrangement of cushions in her private chambers, the presence of trusted advisors who could intervene without alarm all, became part of a carefully orchestrated routine. Yet even these measures were not foolproof. Illness had a way of testing her resolve at moments of greatest importance, like a hidden adversary waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. And it was in these moments, when she was physically vulnerable yet compelled to maintain an image of supreme authority, that Elizabeth's character was most severely tested. The court soon became familiar with the strange rhythm of her condition. Those who served her closely learned to read the faint signs, the slight paleness of her cheeks, the subtle trembling of her hands, the sharp inhalation as she steadied herself before speaking. Courtiers and ambassadors alike became adept at guessing when Elizabeth's strength might falter, yet none dared to exploit it openly. The queen's reputation for shrewd observation and merciless judgment ensured that any attempt to manipulate her weakness would be met with swift consequences. This precarious balance between concealment and observation, between weakness and authority, defined much of her reign and shaped the strategies she used in both diplomacy and domestic politics. Elizabeth's mysterious ailment also influenced her relationships, both personal and political. Advisors like William Cecil and Robert Dudley were privy to her vulnerabilities, though the queen's careful demeanor meant that even they never fully understood the extent of the condition. She depended on them not only for counsel, but for subtle support. The discreet hand to steady her, the tactful redirection of conversation, the careful management of sensitive audiences. In this way, her weakness became intertwined with the dynamics of trust and loyalty within the court. Those who could anticipate and respond to her needs without overstepping earned her favor. Those who misread the signs risked disgrace. Perhaps most poignantly, this hidden fragility underscored the tension between Elizabeth's public persona and her private reality. She projected the image of an immortal monarch, a symbol of England's stability, yet inside, her body betrayed the ordinary human limits she had no choice but to endure. This duality of sovereign who commanded the loyalty and admiration of millions, yet faced intimate struggles invisible to all but a select, added a layer of complexity to her rule. Elizabeth's illness was more than a physical inconvenience. It was a force that shaped her interactions, and ultimately, the course of English history. Over time, Elizabeth became a master of choreography, turning moments of weakness into displays of composure and control. She learned to descend from her throne with grace, to participate in lengthy audiences, and to issue directives with clarity even when her body protested. Her advisors marveled at her ability to maintain authority while managing the unpredictability of her condition. In many ways, the Queen's mysterious weakness became a testament to her extraordinary resilience, a hidden testament to the power of will and determination. Yet, even with these strategies, the fear of exposure never fully disappeared. Elizabeth remained keenly aware that a single episode could spark gossip, ignite political unrest, or embolden foreign enemies. Each flare of weakness reminded her of the precariousness of her position, reinforcing the careful balance she maintained between vulnerability and strength. The queen, who appeared untouchable to her subjects and adversaries, was, in truth, navigating the delicate terrain of human fragility with extraordinary skill and unyielding discipline. In the end, Elizabeth's mysterious ailment was both a curse and a crucible. It revealed the extraordinary demands placed upon her as a monarch, the relentless pressure to maintain perfection, and the private sacrifices required to sustain her public image. It reminded her, and all who served her, that even the most powerful figure in England was still human, subject to the whims of the body and the hidden frailties that lie beneath even the most commanding presence. In a reign defined by intelligence, strategy, and indomitable will, the Queen's hidden weakness became an ever-present shadow, striking at the worst possible moments, yet never fully diminishing the legend of Elizabeth I. Why physicians of the time could not name her suffering, in the opulent, candlelit chambers of the Tudor court, Elizabeth I was often attended by the most learned physicians of her day. They were men of status and training, well-versed in Galenic, humors, and the prevailing medical theories of 16th century Europe. They carried their instruments, prepared herbal concoctions, and consulted thick leather-bound tomes filled with centuries of medical wisdom. Yet, for all their knowledge, they faced a patient they could neither fully understand nor cure. Elizabeth's mysterious weakness, her unpredictable fatigue, and the subtle ailments that flared at the worst possible moments confounded even the most skilled of her physicians. The medical understanding of the era was rudimentary by modern standards. Physicians believed that the human body functioned according to the balance of 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Disease, they taught, arose from imbalances among these humors, and treatments ranged from bloodletting and purgatives to elaborate mixtures of herbs and spices. But Elizabeth's suffering defied easy categorization. Her symptoms were inconsistent. One day, she might appear fatigued, yet sharp of mind. On another, a simple audience could leave her weak and disoriented. No single diagnosis seemed to fit, and every attempted remedy often proved ineffective, leaving both patient and doctor frustrated. Physicians documented their observations meticulously, noting her pallor, occasional palpitations, and fluctuating energy. They recommended tonics, dietary adjustments, and careful rest, yet these measures only offered fleeting relief. One of the Queen's doctors, Dr. Roger, a man well esteemed for his knowledge of herbal medicine, admitted privately in his notes that he could not determine the cause of Her Majesty's ailments, though they do afflict her most grievously. These words, though carefully penned in Latin and concealed from courtly gossip, captured the profound limits of contemporary medicine. No formula, no treatment, no learned theory could fully explain or remedy the suffering of England's most powerful woman. Complicating matters further was Elizabeth's reluctance to display vulnerability. A queen could not afford to appear weak, and Elizabeth often minimized or concealed her symptoms. She would rise for audiences, speak in clear, commanding tones, and issue decrees even as her body trembled or her head throbbed with unrelenting pain. This perfection of public composure made diagnosis even more difficult. Her physicians had only fleeting glimpses of her condition, never the full, private truth. The gaps between what they observed and what truly afflicted her body created a veil of mystery that medical science of the era could not pierce. The unpredictability of Elizabeth's condition also challenged the scientific paradigms of the day. Symptoms that waxed and waned, that defied simple correlation with diet, climate, or stress, left her doctors grasping for answers. Some speculated it was a nervous disorder, while others suggested lingering effects from childhood illnesses or trauma. A few ventured the idea of melancholy, a condition believed to arise from excess black bile, and associated with sadness or emotional imbalance. Yet even these educated guesses lacked certainty. For a monarch whose health was intimately tied to the stability of the kingdom, the inability of her physicians to name or treat her condition introduced a quiet tension into the court. Elizabeth's suffering, though invisible to the general public, shaped the rhythm of her daily life and the decisions she made as a ruler. Episodes of weakness might compel her to shorten council meetings, delegate certain responsibilities, or retreat to her private chambers. Advisors quickly learned to anticipate these fluctuations, adjusting schedules or tempering discussions to accommodate her condition without drawing attention. The Queen's need to conceal her fragility transformed medical uncertainty into a political instrument. Physicians' ignorance became a shield, allowing Elizabeth to maintain authority while masking the limits imposed by her body. Beyond the political and practical challenges, there was also the personal toll. Elizabeth knew that her inability to receive a definitive medical explanation isolated her in a profoundly human way. The physician's expertise, revered as it was, offered only partial understanding. She could not share the intimate details of her suffering with the wider court without risking perceptions of weakness. And yet the lack of diagnosis underscored the stark truth that even the most powerful woman in England was at the mercy of her own body. It created a private space of uncertainty, one in which Elizabeth had to navigate fear, discomfort, and doubt alone. Some physicians resorted to experimentation. They tested different herbal blends, enforced dietary regimens, and even tried rudimentary techniques such as venesection or herbal poultices applied to her temples or limbs. Yet these interventions often provided only temporary relief, sometimes exacerbating her discomfort. Historical accounts suggest that Elizabeth, though patient and polite, grew increasingly skeptical of medical advice, weighing her doctor's counsel against her own instincts and experience. This cautious approach reflects not only her intelligence, but also a deep understanding that in the absence of definitive knowledge, self-reliance was a necessary virtue. The broader medical community, constrained by the limits of contemporary science, was incapable of grasping the complexity of her condition. In a world before germ theory, hormonal understanding, or neurological insight, the Queen's symptoms were an pain and fatigue that eluded explanation, were sometimes dismissed as temperament, emotional imbalance, or exaggeration. Yet, those closest to Elizabeth, including confidants like Robert Dudley and William Cecil, understood that her suffering was real and persistent. They adapted to it, learned its patterns, and provided quiet support, aware that recognition, not diagnosis, was the only feasible remedy in a time when the science of medicine was still in its infancy. The mystery of Elizabeth's suffering would ripple through the rest of her reign. Unseen, unnamed, and untreated, it added an invisible layer of complexity to her rule. Negotiations with foreign powers, military planning, and domestic policy all occurred against a backdrop of a monarch who was often battling private afflictions no one could measure or manage. It was a challenge that only Elizabeth herself could navigate fully, a testament to her extraordinary resilience and the quiet courage required to govern while contending with the unknown. Even centuries later, historians and medical scholars continue to debate what truly afflicted the Virgin Queen. Suggestions range from anemia, hypothyroidism, and autoimmune disorders to psychological trauma rooted in her tumultuous upbringing. Yet the uncertainty is, in many ways, fitting. Elizabeth's reign was defined not only by her political acumen and charisma, but by her ability to endure what no contemporary physician could comprehend. Her suffering, unnamed and unclassified, remains one of the enduring enigmas of her life, a subtle reminder that even the greatest monarchs are, at their core, human. A queen's private struggle in an age terrified of female illness. ElizabethI ruled in a time when the very notion of female weakness was often equated with political instability. In the 16th century, England and indeed much of Europe was steeped in cultural and medical beliefs that associated a woman's body with fragility, hysteria, and emotional excess. For a female monarch, these assumptions were not merely inconveniences. They were potential threats to legitimacy, to authority, and to the very survival of her reign. Every cough, fainting spell, or sign of fatigue could be scrutinized as proof that a woman's body was unsuited to rule, that her intellect might waver under the pressure of leadership, or that her decisions could be clouded by the unpredictable tides of female biology. In this climate, Elizabeth's private struggle took on layers of complexity her male predecessors could scarcely imagine. Her mysterious episodes of weakness were not only personal trials, but also matters of political perception. The queen could not allow herself the luxury of overt illness or public vulnerability. For the court, the kingdom, and foreign observers watched every movement, seeking any hint of imperfection. In her own chambers, she faced a cruel paradox. The body that gave her life and strength also imposed a daily challenge she could never fully reveal. Every feigning fit, every moment of dizziness was a private ordeal, a reminder that even sovereignty could not shield one from the frailty of flesh. Elizabeth's personal struggle was compounded by the societal anxieties of her time. Female illness was often framed as moral weakness, spiritual deficiency, or a sign of inherent inadequacy. Women who exhibited pain or fatigue were sometimes accused of indulgence, of letting their natural emotions interfere with duty. For a queen, such interpretations could be catastrophic. Elizabeth knew that her health or perceived lack thereof might become fodder for critics, plotting nobles, or foreign diplomats eager to question her authority. In this sense, her body was both her own and a battlefield for the scrutiny of an entire nation. The Queen's private chambers became a sanctuary where she could confront these challenges away from the public eye. Here, she allowed herself moments of quiet reflection, acknowledging the toll her condition took on both body and mind. Cushions were arranged to support her during long hours of writing and council deliberation. Herbal remedies were tested with careful moderation and trusted. Attendants monitored her closely, ready to assist at the first sign of distress. Yet these measures were always discreet, for any acknowledgement of weakness could ripple outward, reaching ears that might exploit it politically. Elizabeth's struggle was both intensely personal and inseparably public, a delicate balance she maintained with extraordinary discipline. Even within her own household, the Queen's condition shaped daily life. Servants and advisors became adept at interpreting subtle signals. A pallor in her cheeks, a slight hesitation in her step, a momentary faltering of her speech. These signs dictated how meetings were arranged, how audiences were timed, and how the Queen herself approached her duties. Elizabeth's awareness of her own vulnerability sharpened her political instincts. She learned to use her body strategically, to mask weakness with posture, tone, and timing, creating the illusion of unshakable authority even on days when her energy was limited. Elizabeth's private struggle also intersected with the broader cultural fear of female bodies and their supposed unpredictability. At court, Tales of women overcome by nervous or hysterical conditions circulated readily, often exaggerated or distorted by rumor. A queen could not afford to be associated with such narratives, as they undermined both public confidence and personal dignity. Elizabeth understood this implicitly. By maintaining composure and carefully concealing her ailments, she countered the societal stereotype of women as unreliable leaders. Her very ability to rule effectively in the face of private suffering became a statement against the prevailing assumptions of her age. The Queen's isolation in managing her health also shaped her personal relationships. Trusted advisors and confidants, including William Cecil and Robert Dudley, were aware of her condition, yet even they could not penetrate the full scope of her private experience. Elizabeth shared only as much as was strategically necessary, revealing glimpses of fatigue or discomfort without compromising her authority. This selective disclosure reinforced loyalty among those who could anticipate her needs, while simultaneously protecting the Queen from vulnerability that could be weaponized against her. In this way, her illness influenced not only her governance, but the intricate web of trust and alliance that defined her court. Elizabeth's struggle had profound psychological dimensions as well. The constant awareness that her body might falter at any critical moment weighed on her decisions, her planning, and her mental state. Each audience, each council session, and each ceremonial appearance carried the unspoken question: would her body betray her now, at the precise instant that she needed to project perfection? This underlying tension contributed to a life lived under extraordinary pressure, one in which physical suffering was inseparable from political and emotional vigilance. Historical accounts suggest that Elizabeth approached her private struggle with a combination of stoicism, ingenuity, and keen self. She experimented with remedies, adjusted her daily routines, and cultivated practices to conserve energy and maintain focus. Yet, she also accepted the limitations imposed by her body, recognizing that the demands of monarchy were relentless, and that perfection was ultimately an aspirational rather than attainable goal. This awareness of human fragility did not weaken her. It sharpened her understanding of the delicate interplay between power, perception, and personal resilience. Elizabeth's private struggle in an age terrified of female illness also highlights the broader societal dynamics of the Tudor period. Women were often medicalized in ways that men were not, and female rulers faced skepticism purely on the basis of gender. By navigating her health challenges without public acknowledgement, Elizabeth not only preserved her authority, but also challenged the deeply ingrained prejudices of her time. Her reign became a testament to the capacity of a woman to exercise supreme power, even while managing conditions that her contemporaries could neither name nor fully understand. Ultimately, Elizabeth's private struggle illuminates a dimension of her rule that is often overshadowed by political achievements and public spectacle. The queen who negotiated with kings, commanded armies, and endured conspiracies against her throne did so while contending with personal vulnerability that remained largely invisible to the world. This hidden struggle shaped by physical weakness, societal fear, and the demands of sovereignty reveals a profoundly human aspect of a monarch often idealized for her strength and cunning. In the shadows of her private chambers, ElizabethI endured the tension between human frailty and the extraordinary expectations of an era that demanded perfection from a female ruler, crafting a legacy of resilience, ingenuity, and quiet courage that would endure long after her reign. How Elizabeth used wit and image to hide her physical vulnerabilities. Elizabeth I ruled an empire as much with her mind and presence as with her armies, her council, or her treaties. Yet behind the grandeur and the meticulously constructed image of the Virgin Queen, she faced challenges that required ingenuity of a different sort. The subtle art of masking physical vulnerability, her mysterious weakness, episodes of fatigue, and occasional discomfort were truths she could never reveal publicly. In a world where any sign of frailty could be interpreted as a threat to authority, Elizabeth learned early that survival depended not only on skillful governance, but on the clever orchestration of appearance, wit, and public image. The Queen's approach was strategic and deliberate. Clothing, posture, and ornamentation became tools as potent as any decree. Her wardrobe, famed for its lavish embroidery, stiff collars, and rich fabrics, was more than a statement of wealth. It was a shield. Ruffs were arranged to obscure tension in her neck. Corsets provided support to her body when fatigue threatened to betray her, and layers of intricate gowns created the illusion of steadiness and vigor. Even the choice of colors was calculated. Bright hues projected vitality, while the precise cut of sleeves and bodices suggested elegance and control. Every detail was measured to transform a fragile body into the image of unshakable majesty. Beyond fashion, Elizabeth wielded wit as both a weapon and a protective tool. She was renowned for her sharp tongue, her clever retorts, and her ability to disarm critics with humor. In audiences, she often used playful banter to deflect attention from any signs of weakness, turning potentially awkward moments into demonstrations of intelligence and authority. This verbal agility not only captivated courtiers and foreign diplomats, but also served as a subtle form of control. If she could dominate the conversation and command attention, there was less opportunity for anyone to notice the physical strains she endured. Wit became armor, a way of turning vulnerability into a display of cunning that reinforced rather than undermined her. Authority. Elizabeth's use of image extended to ceremonial occasions as well. State entrances, royal progresses, and formal audiences were choreographed with meticulous precision. Every step, gesture, and glance was carefully calculated to convey strength and composure. When fatigue threatened, she leaned on assistance or adjusted the pace of processions subtly, ensuring that observers interpreted her movements as grace rather than frailty. These orchestrations were invisible to most, yet they required constant awareness and practice, a testament to the Queen's intelligence and discipline. Her very body became a stage, a medium through which the narrative of power and stability was communicated, masking the vulnerabilities that could not be acknowledged openly. Even her speech was a tool of concealment. Elizabeth trained herself to project her voice clearly, to maintain energy through long council meetings, and to modulate tone to convey authority even when she felt physically drained. Advisors and ambassadors often remarked on her stamina and eloquence, unaware of the internal struggle required to maintain such poise. In moments of particular weakness, she relied on subtle pacing of conversation, strategic pauses, or the interjection of humor to navigate potentially compromising situations. The careful orchestration of voice, gesture, and expression allowed her to maintain the illusion of an invulnerable monarch, even when her body suggested otherwise. Elizabeth also manipulated the perception of time and presence to her advantage. Audiences could be briefed, meetings staggered, and ceremonial events timed to minimize the risk of her condition becoming apparent. In private, she permitted herself rest, recuperation, and the management of her own health, while publicly maintaining the energy and focus expected of a sovereign. This dual existence, private vulnerability, Public perfection required discipline, foresight, and an extraordinary awareness of human perception. It was a delicate balancing act that few could emulate, and one that became a hallmark of her reign. The Queen's mastery of image extended to interactions with foreign dignitaries. Ambassadors from Spain, France, and other European powers were often struck by her seeming vitality and poise. Yet Elizabeth's careful cultivation of perception was not mere vanity. It was a tactical necessity. Any hint of illness could be interpreted as weakness by rival courts, potentially emboldening adversaries or destabilizing diplomatic negotiations. By controlling how she appeared, how she spoke, and how she moved, Elizabeth ensured that even those closest to her were never entirely certain of her true state, preserving both authority and mystique. Elizabeth's wit was equally critical in managing court politics. The Tudor court was rife with intrigue, ambition, and rivalry, and a queen who appeared vulnerable could become a target for manipulation or criticism. She used humor to disarm potential adversaries, to redirect attention, and to assert dominance in conversations where power dynamics were subtle but important. Courtiers quickly learned that cleverness and charm were as essential as strength of arm or intellect. Wits allowed the queen to maintain control, to entertain and command loyalty, and to conceal moments of private struggle without compromising her rule. Her mastery of image and wit was also reflected in her personal correspondence and written declarations. Letters to allies, speeches to Parliament, and public proclamations were carefully worded to project confidence, intelligence, and unyielding authority. The deliberate crafting of language allowed Elizabeth to communicate power even when her physical condition might have suggested otherwise. Words became instruments, shaping perception in a society that judged rulers not only by action but by the impression they left on observers. Elizabeth's approach to masking vulnerability was holistic: clothing, posture, wit, oratory, timing, and even the choreography of daily routines were integrated into a sophisticated system of self-presentation. Each element reinforced the others, creating a seamless narrative of strength and stability. Her advisors came to rely on this choreography as much as on her political decisions. It was both performance and defense, a strategy that maintained her authority while protecting her from the dangers that disclosure of weakness might entail. In essence, Elizabeth's ability to conceal her physical vulnerabilities was a defining aspect of her reign. It required foresight, intelligence, and an acute awareness of perception in an era when female rulers were scrutinized more intensely than their male counterparts. By blending wit, image, and strategic presentation, she transformed moments of personal challenge into demonstrations of control, turning her private struggles into tools that reinforced rather than weakened her sovereignty. Ultimately, Elizabeth's mastery of concealment was not simply an act of vanity or theatrics. It was survival. In a court that demanded perfection, in a society that feared female weakness, and in a political landscape where any sign of frailty could be exploited, the Queen's clever management of appearance and demeanor ensured her place as a powerful, enduring, and enigmatic ruler. Her wit and carefully curated image allowed her to navigate the constant tension between human vulnerability and the unyielding expectations of monarchy, leaving a legacy that continues to fascinate historians and storytellers alike. The public mask that protected her from foreign kings and domestic plots. ElizabethI was acutely aware that every movement she made, every word she spoke, and every glance she offered could be scrutinized by enemies, both within and beyond her realm. In the turbulent political landscape of 16th century Europe. Appearances were not merely symbolic, they were instruments of power. For a female monarch, especially one as young and unmarried as Elizabeth, the stakes were exceptionally high. A single misstep, a visible moment of weakness, or even a fleeting expression could be interpreted as vulnerability, giving foreign kings and domestic conspirators the pretext to challenge her authority. It was in response to these pressures that Elizabeth cultivated what would become one of the most critical tools of her reign, the public mask. This mask was not a literal covering, of course, but a carefully constructed persona, blending poise, confidence, and strategic restraint. Elizabeth's public appearances were choreographed with the precision of a courtly dance. Every gesture was measured, every phrase delivered with intent. The Queen understood that foreign emissaries, the calculating Habsburgs of Spain, to the ambitious Valois of Francois, watching not just her policies, but her demeanor. An arch of an eyebrow, a momentary hesitation, or an ill-timed laugh could be interpreted as indecision or emotional weakness, potentially jeopardizing alliances or emboldening enemies. The public mask allowed Elizabeth to navigate these interactions with grace, maintaining the perception of unwavering authority while shielding her body's private vulnerabilities. Elizabeth's mask was equally vital against domestic threats. The Tudor court, with its intricate web of noble families, factions, and ambitious courtiers, was a breeding ground for intrigue. Plots were constant, and loyalty was often transactional. Some courtiers coveted influence over the Queen, while others plotted to replace her entirely. In such an environment, any display of physical weakness or emotional uncertainty could be perceived as an opportunity to manipulate the sovereign. By projecting an unassailable exterior, Elizabeth neutralized potential threats, ensuring that conspirators could not easily exploit moments of private struggle. Her mask was both a shield and a weapon, enabling her to maintain control in a court where trust was fragile and betrayal common. The Queen's mastery of her public image extended beyond physical posture. Her speech, attire, and rituals were carefully orchestrated to reinforce the persona of the Virgin Queen, resolute, intelligent, and above personal entanglements. Her iconic white complexion, meticulously arranged ruffs, and regal gowns conveyed an almost otherworldly sense of perfection. Ambassadors and visitors often remarked on her poise and elegance, unaware that beneath the surface, the Queen contended with fatigue, discomfort, and the constant pressure to maintain the mask was not deception for its own sake. It was a necessary adaptation, a survival strategy in an era when a monarch's strength was evaluated as much by appearance as by action. Elizabeth's public mask also included a keen psychological understanding of those around her. She knew that perception could be manipulated as effectively as any army or diplomatic negotiation. By maintaining a consistent exterior, she created a sense of predictability that reassured allies while intimidating potential adversaries. Even the most cunning foreign emissaries could never be certain of her true condition, her private intentions, or the depth of her strategic calculations. In this way, the mask extended her influence, allowing Elizabeth to control not only her image, but also the perceptions and reactions of those who sought to understand or undermine her. The protective function of the mask was particularly evident in her dealings with foreign kings, who often tested boundaries in pursuit of advantage. Negotiations with Spain, France, and Scotland demanded careful attention to protocol, expression, and demeanor. Elizabeth's ability to conceal physical frailty and project unyielding authority allowed her to navigate delicate discussions, resist intimidation, and secure outcomes favorable to England. The mask served as a buffer, preserving the Queen's credibility while concealing the vulnerabilities that might have been exploited by those who sought to challenge her reign. Domestically, the mask was equally critical. England's nobility was a tapestry of ambition, rivalry, and factionalism. Plots to undermine the Queen's authority were constant threats, and even a subtle misstep could be seized upon by ambitious courtiers. Elizabeth's careful cultivation of composure, wit, and strategic presentation allowed her to navigate these dangers. By maintaining a consistent public persona, she minimized opportunities for manipulation and ensured that her advisors, courtiers, and the broader population saw only the strength and intelligence she intended to project. The Queen's use of the public mask extended into ceremonies, public appearances, and audience interactions. Every event was staged to communicate authority, stability, and vitality. Lengthy processions, audience protocols, and the choreography of court rituals were designed not merely for spectacle, but to reinforce the illusion of unshakable power. Even when Elizabeth's body protested, the public mask enabled her to fulfill her duties with an air of effortless control. Observers rarely suspected the careful calculation behind each gesture, the subtle adjustments made to protect her image, or the private fatigue she endured. Importantly, the mask was also a tool of psychological defense. By controlling what was visible and shaping how she was perceived, Elizabeth maintained a sense of autonomy in an environment where personal freedom was often constrained by political necessity. The mask allowed her to dictate the terms of engagement, to navigate diplomacy, and to assert authority while concealing vulnerabilities that might invite exploitation. It was a form of power as subtle as it was effective, blending performance, strategy, and personal resilience into a seamless whole. Elizabeth's public mask was more than a political necessity. It was a testament to her extraordinary intelligence and adaptability. It reflected a sophisticated understanding of human perception, the strategic value of appearance, and the psychological demands of leadership. By projecting unwavering composure, she controlled the narrative of her reign, neutralized threats, and maintained the confidence of both domestic and foreign audiences. At the same time, the mask allowed her to protect the private self, concealing the physical struggles and vulnerabilities that history would later explore, but that contemporaries could never fully perceive. In essence, the public mask was a defining feature of Elizabeth's reign. It allowed her to navigate a treacherous political landscape, maintain authority in the face of constant threat, and project an image of invincibility that reinforced her power. The Queen's ability to balance private vulnerability with public perception highlights not only her political acumen, but also her personal resilience, creativity, and understanding of the profound interplay between image and influence. By mastering this delicate art, Elizabeth I preserved her sovereignty, commanded respect across Europe, and ensured that her legacy would endure as one of the most remarkable examples of leadership in history. Whispers in the court, rumors that became Elizabeth's constant shadow. Elizabeth I's reign was not only defined by political acumen, diplomacy, and military strategy, but also by the pervasive presence of rumor and intrigue in the opulent halls of the Tudor court. Whispers traveled faster than royal proclamations, shaping opinions, influencing alliances, and sometimes threatening the very stability of the monarchy. For Elizabeth, these murmurs were more than idle gossip. They were an ever-present, invisible force that she had to navigate carefully. No matter how controlled her public image, no matter how meticulous her appearance or wit, The queen could never fully escape the shadow cast by speculation and rumor. The nature of courtly whispers was both subtle and potent. Courtiers, ambitious nobles, and foreign emissaries alike circulated stories of Elizabeth's personal life, her health, and her relationships. Each tale, however fanciful or malicious, had the potential to undermine authority or embolden political adversaries. A faint sigh during an audience could be exaggerated into a narrative of illness. A private conversation with a favorite courtier could be interpreted as evidence of favoritism or scandal. In a society where perception was inseparable from power, these whispers could shape reality almost as effectively as decrees or edicts. Some rumors targeted Elizabeth's health, an already sensitive and private matter. Accounts circulated that the queen suffered from chronic weakness, mysterious ailments, or even frailty that could compromise her capacity to rule. While physicians and courtiers knew the truth, or, as much as could be known, the public narrative was shaped as much by imagination and fear as by observation. Every misstep, every sudden pause during a ceremony was fodder for interpretation. Elizabeth understood that these stories, while potentially damaging, could also be managed through careful strategy. By controlling her appearances, timing, and public conduct, she mitigated the effects of gossip without drawing direct attention to her vulnerabilities. Other rumors focused on her relationships, both personal and political. Elizabeth's unmarried status was a constant source of speculation. Courtiers and foreign diplomats alike questioned whether she might marry, and if so, whom she might choose. Each conversation with a favored courtier, each gesture or glance, was scrutinized and reinterpreted through the lens of ambition, romance, and power. Robert Dudley William Cecil and other close advisors were often central to these stories. Their presence and proximity to the queen, subject to endless conjecture, while Elizabeth skillfully navigated these narratives using her wit and control of public perception. The whispers never ceased. They became a shadow she carried constantly, shaping her interactions and reinforcing the delicate balancing act of courtly life. The queen's awareness of rumors extended beyond personal matters to political maneuvering. Every decision, every alliance, and every declaration was susceptible to misinterpretation. Letters intercepted or intentionally leaked could transform routine diplomacy into scandal. Minor disagreements between courtiers could escalate into whispers of conspiracy. Elizabeth's experience and intelligence allowed her to anticipate the emergence of such narratives, to counteract them with strategic communication, and to use them to her advantage when possible. She recognized that while she could not stop rumors entirely, she could control how they affected her rule and how she responded to them. Elizabeth's mastery of perception became a defensive mechanism against the destabilizing effects of gossip. She cultivated an image of composure, intellect, and inviolable authority that left little room for doubt. Her wit, eloquence, and carefully choreographed presence turned potential opportunities for scandal into demonstrations of control. Rumors arose. The queen often responded indirectly, addressing issues through public speeches, letters, or subtle actions that reinforced her narrative of strength. By doing so, she transformed whispers from a threat into a tool, using them to reinforce her image as an unassailable monarch. The constant presence of rumor also shaped Elizabeth's inner life, even as she exercised careful control over public appearances. The knowledge that whispers could distort reality added a layer of vigilance to her daily existence. She could never fully relax, for any moment of perceived weakness or impropriety might be magnified and spread through the court. This perpetual awareness demanded psychological resilience, strategic thinking, and an extraordinary ability to manage both perception and emotion. The queen's intelligence, discipline, and charisma were tested daily by the silent, omnipresent force of gossip that threatened to define her rule if left unchecked. Elizabeth's court became a microcosm of rumor's power. Courtiers competed not only for favor, but for control over narratives. Alliances were as much about perception as policy, and the queen's attention could amplify or diminish a story's effect. Some courtiers sought to protect her from misinformation, while others used gossip strategically to advance their own positions. Elizabeth's skill lay in her ability to discern intent, to interpret subtle signals, and to act decisively to maintain authority without revealing her own vulnerabilities. The court, in this way, became a living stage where rumor and power intersected, and where Elizabeth's mastery of perception determined the stability of her reign. Foreign ambassadors were particularly attentive to whispers in the court, interpreting every minor incident as potentially significant. Elizabeth understood that these external observers relied on rumor as a source of intelligence, and she sometimes used this to her advantage. By allowing subtle stories to circulate, she could manipulate perceptions abroad, shaping the behavior of foreign powers without revealing her true intentions. Rumor, in her hands, became a strategic instrument, a means of influence that complemented diplomacy, military strength, and political negotiation. Ultimately, whispers became an inseparable part of Elizabeth's reign, a constant shadow that followed her in public and private. They tested her patience, sharpened her judgment, and demanded vigilance. But they also highlighted her extraordinary skill in managing perception. Her ability to navigate a court rife with speculation, intrigue, and observation became a hallmark of her rule. In the delicate balance between truth and appearance, Elizabeth maintained control, demonstrating that a sovereign's power lies not only in decree and action, but in the mastery of narrative and perception. In the end, Elizabeth I's legacy was shaped as much by her handling of rumor as by her political, military, and diplomatic achievements. The whispers of the court, those persistent, subtle, and often distorted accounts of her health, relationships, and decisions, became an integral part of the environment she commanded. By understanding, anticipating, and manipulating them, Elizabeth preserved her authority, reinforced her image, and ensured that her reign endured as a testament to strategic intelligence, resilience, and the artful management of perception. The court's whispers, once a potential threat, ultimately underscored the Queen's unmatched ability to govern in a world where every word and gesture carried the weight of history. Why trust became a luxury she could no longer afford. ElizabethI's life as queen was defined by the delicate interplay between power, loyalty, and suspicion. In the Tudor court, trust was a fragile commodity, easily undermined by ambition, jealousy, and the constant threat of betrayal. For a female monarch in 16th century England, where every action was scrutinized and every word potentially weaponized, trust was both essential and perilous. Elizabeth quickly learned that to survive, to maintain authority, and to protect her kingdom, she could no longer afford to extend complete trust to even those closest to her. The lessons of her youth, marked by betrayal, political machinations, and the execution of her motherhead, instilled a cautiousness that would guide her every decision for decades. From her earliest days on the throne, Elizabeth faced a world in which loyalty was often conditional and fragile. Nobles and advisors competed not only for influence, but for proximity to the Queen herself. hoping to shape policy and secure advantage. Some were genuinely devoted, while others sought to manipulate her authority for personal gain. This reality demanded constant vigilance. Every recommendation, every counsel, and every display of allegiance had to be scrutinized carefully. Elizabeth became adept at reading motives, interpreting subtle gestures, and weighing the reliability of those around her. Trust was no longer a given. It was unmeasured and cautiously extended, often in small, deliberate increments. The dangers of misplaced trust were starkly evident in the realm of politics. Courtiers who appeared loyal could secretly conspire with foreign powers, plot rebellion, or undermine her decisions through rumor and misinformation. Advisors who offered counsel might do so with hidden agendas, turning even seemingly sound advice into a potential trap. Elizabeth's strategic brilliance lay not only in her ability to recognize competence, but in her capacity to assess character, anticipate motives, and manage the complex web of relationships that defined her court. She had learned that one misjudgment could have catastrophic consequences, threatening both her personal safety and the stability of the kingdom. Elizabeth's experience with betrayal extended beyond politics into matters of personal allegiance. Even trusted confidants, such as Robert Dudley and William Cecil, required careful navigation. While their loyalty was genuine, the Queen understood that proximity to her power could tempt ambition, desire, or miscalculation. By maintaining a careful distance, exercising subtle control, and testing loyalties through measured interactions, Elizabeth ensured that those closest to her remained aligned with her objectives without becoming threats to her autonomy. Trust, in her world, was never absolute. It was provisional, conditional, and constantly reassessed. The Queen's approach to trust also intersected with her own personal vulnerabilities. Her mysterious health issues, episodes of fatigue, and private struggles added layers of complexity to relationships within the court. Advisors, servants, and foreign emissaries could sense weakness, interpret caution as indecision, or exploit moments of private struggle. Elizabeth learned that transparency about her condition could invite manipulation, while secrecy preserved authority. In this environment, trust became not only a personal concern, but a political imperative. Her mastery of discretion, judgment, and perception allowed her to navigate these challenges, safeguarding both her rule and her private life. Elizabeth's cautious approach to trust extended to foreign relations as well. Ambassadors and envoys often arrived at court with hidden objectives, seeking to influence alliances, trade agreements, or military strategies. Every interaction required careful attention. A seemingly minor gesture could be misread. A word of confidence could be exploited. Elizabeth relied on her keen intellect, strategic foresight, and ability to manage appearances to navigate these high-stakes encounters. By controlling what she revealed, she preserved a position of authority and leveraged trust as a tool rather than a vulnerability. Domestically, trust was a constant negotiation. The Queen's household was a complex ecosystem of noble families, courtiers, and servants, each with varying degrees of loyalty and ambition. Elizabeth's strategic acumen allowed her to identify reliable allies, assign roles that reinforced her authority, and monitor relationships for signs of betrayal. In a court rife with intrigue, trust became a calculated instrument, extended sparingly, observed carefully, and reinforced through reciprocal loyalty and shared purpose. Even the most devoted advisors understood that Elizabeth's trust was not freely given. It had to be demonstrated through competence, discretion, and alignment with the crown's interests. The necessity of cautious trust shaped Elizabeth's personal demeanor and decision-making style. She cultivated an aura of inscrutability, maintaining composure and careful expression in all interactions. By limiting access to her innermost thoughts, she protected both herself and the realm. This careful management of trust extended to public perception as well. The Queen projected an image of controlled authority, ensuring that subjects, courtiers, and foreign powers alike recognized her as a ruler whose loyalty could not be assumed or easily swayed. Her strength lay in her ability to maintain equilibrium between accessibility and guardedness, demonstrating fairness without exposing vulnerability. Elizabeth's approach to trust also highlights a broader tension inherent in rulership, the interplay between human connection and political necessity. While genuine alliances were invaluable, they were always tempered by the recognition that ambitions, desires, and personal interests could conflict with the sovereign's objectives. The Queen's brilliance lay in her ability to balance these dynamics, maintaining loyalty, cultivating support, and ensuring the cohesion of her court while safeguarding her authority. Trust, in Elizabeth's world, was not a moral expectation but a strategic tool, carefully calibrated and continuously evaluated. The lessons Elizabeth drew from her cautious approach to trust were reinforced over decades of reign. She learned to recognize deception, reward reliability, and preempt potential threats with foresight and discretion. Her experience demonstrated that in an environment dominated by ambition, rumor, and human frailty, trust could not be assumed. It was earned through consistent behavior, proven loyalty, and alignment with the Queen's objectives. By mastering the art of measured trust, Elizabeth navigated the complex political landscape of Tudor England with exceptional skill, preserving both her personal safety and the stability of the realm. Ultimately, the luxury of unconditional trust was unavailable to Elizabeth I in her world. Every relationship, every interaction, and every alliance carried potential risk. By understanding this reality and developing strategies to manage loyalty, perception, and vulnerability, the Queen ensured her survival and reinforced her authority. Her ability to navigate a court rife with intrigue, suspicion, and ambition highlights the extraordinary intelligence, discipline, and resilience that defined her reign. Trust, though scarce and carefully rationed, became a cornerstone of her strategic approach to power, allowing her to maintain sovereignty in a world where human motivations were as unpredictable and treacherous as the shifting tides of politics. The loneliness of power in a world built by men. Elizabeth I ruled a kingdom and commanded a court in an era when the structures of power were almost exclusively designed by and for men. Every institution, tradition, and expectation reflected a patriarchal framework that assumed women were subordinate, fragile, or inherently incapable of sovereign leadership. Within this context, the Queen's authority was an extraordinary anomaly, one that demanded not only political skill, but a constant awareness of isolation. The crown conferred power, prestige, and visibility, yet it also imposed a profound loneliness that was inescapable. Every decision carried weight, every interaction was scrutinized, and every trust extended had to be measured against the realities of a male-dominated society. From the earliest days of her reign, Elizabeth experienced the tension between public authority and private solitude, while courtiers, advisors, and foreign emissaries surrounded her. Few could truly comprehend the weight of her position or the pressures that accompanied it. Decisions about war, diplomacy, domestic policy, and succession rested solely on her judgment. Even those closest to her, Cecil Dudley and other trusted figures, were constrained by their own ambitions, fears, and limitations. The Queen's intellect and perception were unparalleled. Yet the isolation inherent in her role meant that guidance, sympathy, or companionship were rare commodities. In a world where men controlled both power and narrative, Elizabeth navigated her sovereignty alone, acutely aware of the gulf between responsibility and understanding. The societal constraints of the time compounded Elizabeth's sense of isolation. Women were expected to occupy domestic, supportive roles, not to exercise authority over armies, legislatures, or the complex machinery of state. As a female monarch, Elizabeth faced skepticism, subtle undermining, and overt hostility from those who questioned a woman's ability to rule. Her male advisors, while often loyal, could never fully share the pressures or fears associated with her position. Each negotiation, each policy decision, each public appearance required the Queen to rely on her own intellect and resilience, reinforcing a profound and ongoing solitude that was inseparable from her authority. Elizabeth's personal experiences of loss and betrayal further intensified the loneliness of her power. The execution of her mother, Anne Boleyn, and the volatile reigns of her predecessors provided stark examples of the dangers faced by women in power. These early experiences instilled caution and but they also highlighted the absence of reliable companionship. Advisors could guide, counselors could advise, and courtiers could flatter. But no one could share the unique burden of being a female sovereign in a world unprepared to accept her authority. The Queen's solitude was thus both a psychological reality and a structural inevitability, shaped by history, culture, and gendered expectations. The demands of court protocol and the omnipresent scrutiny of society amplified this loneliness. Elizabeth was constantly observed, measured, and interpreted by her court, her subjects, and foreign observers. Her actions, gestures, and decisions were dissected for signs of weakness or error. This relentless attention left little room for candid emotional expression, genuine intimacy, or vulnerability. Even friendships and alliances were colored by strategy, ambition, or necessity. In this environment, the Queen learned that solitude was not simply a consequence of circumstance, but a prerequisite for survival. Her authority required it, her security depended on it, and her mental resilience was forged within its confines. The isolation of power was evident in Elizabeth's relationships. While she engaged with advisors, courtiers, and diplomats, these connections were often mediated by duty and necessity rather than personal affinity. Even Robert Dudley, one of the few individuals who approached her emotionally, could not bridge the fundamental loneliness imposed by her role. The Queen's decisions had to be guided by reason, strategy, and perception, leaving little room for companionship, uncolored by political considerations. Her closest relationships were therefore carefully managed, balanced between trust and caution, affection and prudence, revealing the unique emotional calculus required of a woman at the apex of power. Elizabeth's experience demonstrates the broader dynamics of gender and authority in the Tudor period. Men occupied virtually all positions of influence, from military command to judicial office, and societal norms emphasized male decision-making as rational and competent. Elizabeth's success challenged these norms, yet it also isolated her. Within a system not designed to accommodate female sovereignty, she had to rely on intellect, strategic acumen, and personal resilience to assert authority, making her power both remarkable and profoundly solitary. In a sense, the very structures that she mastered were those that reinforced her separation from the world she governed. The Queen's solitude was also strategic. By maintaining a degree of emotional distance, Elizabeth reduced the potential for manipulation, betrayal, or influence by those who might exploit intimacy for personal gain. In a court rife with ambition and intrigue, the isolation of power became both protective and necessary. While it exacted an emotional cost, it allowed the Queen to act decisively, maintain authority, and preserve the integrity of her reign. The careful management of relationships, the measured granting of access, and the cultivation of an aura of independence all reinforce the dual realities of power and loneliness. Elizabeth's mastery of isolation and self-reliance highlights a critical aspect of leadership rarely visible in historical accounts: the emotional and psychological demands of sovereignty. While modern narratives often focus on her political skill, military triumphs, and diplomatic maneuvering, the Queen's inner life was shaped by constant awareness of the gulf between responsibility and companionship. Every decision had consequences that extended beyond the immediate political sphere, and the awareness that few could truly share in these burdens intensified her solitude. In this way, the loneliness of power became an inseparable feature of Elizabeth's reign. Inseparable from her authority, her strategy, and her enduring legacy. Ultimately, the loneliness of power in Elizabeth's world illustrates the intersection of gender, authority, and human experience. She wielded unmatched political skill, navigated complex domestic and international challenges, and maintained sovereignty in a world that sought to constrain female power. Yet these achievements came at the cost of isolation, requiring the Queen to rely on intellect, discipline, and emotional resilience to endure the psychological weight of leadership. In a court built by men and for men, Elizabeth's life exemplifies the extraordinary demands placed upon a woman in power, the simultaneous exercise of authority, and the endurance of profound solitude. Her ability to navigate this delicate balance underscores not only her political genius, but also the personal sacrifices that defined her reign and shaped her enduring historical legacy. How her illness quietly shaped England's golden age. Elizabeth I's reign is celebrated as a period of extraordinary cultural, political, and economic flourishing, and era historians have come to call England's golden age. Yet, behind the grandeur of Shakespeare's plays, the expansion of trade, and the triumphs of the English navy, the Queen's mysterious illness quietly influenced the course of history. Her private, physical struggles, often hidden from public view, shaped her decisions in ways subtle yet profound. The demands of rulership were enormous, and the need to maintain appearances in the face of vulnerability influenced how she governed, who she trusted, and how she engaged with both domestic and foreign affairs. Elizabeth's condition, whatever its exact nature, was never openly discussed at court, but it was a factor she had to consider in every aspect of governance. Episodes of fatigue, discomfort, or sudden weakness could occur at critical moments, and the Queen had to anticipate them meticulously. This awareness influenced the pacing of negotiations, the timing of public appearances, and even the orchestration of her court's ceremonial events. By carefully planning when and how she would present herself to the public and to visiting dignitaries, Elizabeth ensured that her personal challenges did not become vulnerabilities that could be exploited. In effect, her illness guided the rhythm of English political life, shaping decisions in subtle but meaningful ways. One of the most significant ways her health influenced governance was in the realm of diplomacy. Elizabeth's England faced threats and opportunities from powerful nations such as Spain and France, both eager to influence the balance of power in Europe. The Queen's need to manage her condition meant she relied heavily on trusted advisors like William Cecil, Sir Francis Walsingham, and Robert Dudley to carry the weight of detailed negotiations. By delegating certain responsibilities while retaining ultimate authority, Elizabeth transformed potential limitations into a governance strategy. Her advisors' expertise complemented her vision, ensuring that England maintained stability even when the Queen herself required careful management of her energy and presence. The illness also shaped domestic policy in ways that historians have often overlooked. Elizabeth's sensitivity to her physical limits made her cautious about large-scale campaigns of violence or military overextension. Decisions about taxation, naval expeditions, and the suppression of rebellions were influenced not only by strategic calculations but also by the practical need to ensure her presence and health were not unduly compromised. By integrating awareness of her own condition into governance, Elizabeth introduced a form of careful, considered leadership that emphasized the balance and long-term stability, a hallmark of her golden age. Culturally, Elizabeth's illness had a subtle impact on court life and patronage. Her attention to ceremony, appearance, and public perception was heightened by her desire to conceal weakness, leading to an unprecedented flourishing of art, fashion, and pageantry. The careful choreography of court rituals, the elaborate staging of masks and entertainments, and the precise cultivation of her image all contributed to a court culture that celebrated sophistication, elegance, and symbolic power. In this sense, her personal challenges became intertwined with the cultural achievements of the period, reinforcing the notion that the Golden Age was as much a product of perception and presentation as of material prosperity. Elizabeth's physical struggles also shaped her approach to foreign threats and exploration. The expansion of English influence overseas, from the voyages of Sir Francis Drake to early colonization efforts in the New World, was undertaken with careful attention to the Queen's need for stability at home. Delegation of authority to trusted captains and explorers allowed her to extend England's reach without compromising her health or the continuity of domestic governance. Her strategic choices demonstrated an awareness that leadership required both vision and pragmatism, balancing ambition with the realities of personal and political endurance. Even in matters of succession and marriage, Elizabeth's illness subtly influenced policy and personal The Queen's careful management of her health may have contributed to her decision to remain unmarried, avoiding the additional vulnerabilities that marriage could introduce both politically and physically. By remaining the Virgin Queen, she preserved a degree of autonomy and control that allowed her to navigate a complex political landscape with precision, even while contending with private physical limitations. This choice, informed in part by her condition, became a defining feature of her reign and a symbol of England's strength and stability. Elizabeth's illness also fostered a culture of resilience and resourcefulness within her court. Advisors, servants, and courtiers learned to anticipate her needs, manage the flow of information, and maintain the smooth operation of government even during periods of fatigue or discomfort. This reliance on careful organization and delegation reinforced the efficiency and adaptability of the Tudor administration. In effect, the Queen's condition helped shape a government capable of enduring both internal and external challenges, contributing to the broader stability that underpinned England's Golden Age. The Queen's private struggle also influenced her relationship with her subjects by projecting strength and composure despite vulnerability. Elizabeth cultivated a public image of resilience that inspired loyalty admiration, and respect. Her ability to maintain authority while concealing personal difficulties reinforced her mystique and enhanced her symbolic power as the embodiment of the nation. In this way, her illness indirectly contributed to the unifying national identity and cultural confidence that defined the period, intertwining personal resilience with the broader narrative of England's ascendancy. Elizabeth's subtle management of illness, appearance, and energy underscores the complex interplay between private experience and public achievement. The Golden Age was not solely the product of economic expansion, artistic innovation, or military success. It was shaped by the Queen's extraordinary ability to navigate personal challenges while maintaining the stability and perception of authority. Her life demonstrates that even the most celebrated historical achievements are often influenced by human vulnerabilities, and that personal struggle can quietly guide the course of national destiny. Ultimately, Elizabeth I's health, hidden, mysterious, and sometimes debilitating, was a quiet architect of her era. It shaped diplomacy, culture, domestic policy, exploration, and governance in ways that were invisible to contemporaries, but enduring in their effects. By managing her condition with intelligence, discretion, and foresight, Elizabeth ensured that England not only survived the political and military pressures of the 16th century, but thrived, entering a period of cultural and national flourishing remembered centuries later as a golden age. Her ability to integrate private challenge with public triumph highlights the profound, often hidden ways in which human frailty can influence the trajectory of history. The final years. A weary queen holding tight to a crumbling mask. As Elizabeth I entered the final years of her reign, the weight of decades spent wielding power and maintaining an unassailable public persona began to take its toll. The carefully constructed mask she had worn for so long, the poised, invincible image of the Virgin Queen, showed subtle cracks, both physically and emotionally. Her mysterious illness, chronic fatigue, and the relentless pressures of ruling a kingdom in an age of uncertainty made the act of sustaining her persona increasingly arduous. Each day demanded the same meticulous choreography of appearances, the same vigilance in public engagements, and the same psychological fortitude to conceal vulnerability. Yet, the years had begun to wear on her resolve and her body. The court, which had long been a stage for Elizabeth's brilliance and cunning, became a place of quiet strain. Advisors and courtiers noticed the subtle changes. A tremor in her hand during audiences, a fleeting look of weariness in her eyes, a rare hesitation in speech, though still formidable in presence. The Queen's energy was less abundant, and the constant demands of leadership grew heavier with age. Elizabeth's understanding of perception had not diminished, but her physical limitations required her to rely even more on careful planning, delegation, and strategic withdrawal. Every public appearance had to be considered in the context of stamina and capability, as even minor missteps could ignite speculation about her health and authority. The final years also brought intensifying political and diplomatic pressures. England faced ongoing threats from Spain, France, and other European powers, and internal tensions, including religious conflict and succession debates, demanded constant attention. Elizabeth's advisors carried much of the operational burden, yet the Queen remained the ultimate arbiter of policy, her decisions shaping the fate of her nation. The mask, while still effective, became an increasingly delicate instrument. Maintaining authority required not only political acumen, but a careful calibration of public appearance. Projecting strength, while concealing the fatigue and physical limitations threatened to undermine her image. Elizabeth's personal life remained marked by solitude, the emotional and social isolation she had cultivated as a necessary defense against intrigue now carried the additional weight of age and declining energy. Long-standing companions and advisors continued to provide counsel and loyalty, yet the Queen's relationships were inevitably filtered through the lens of duty, strategy, and political necessity. Moments of private reflection likely highlighted the tension between her extraordinary achievements and the personal sacrifices required to maintain them. The mask, once a source of power, had become both a shield and a burden, demanding performance even when the spirit and body were weary. The Queen's illness played a subtle but decisive role during these final years. Episodes of weakness, chronic fatigue, and other unexplained ailments constrained her ability to travel, attend ceremonies, or engage in prolonged diplomatic negotiations. Elizabeth responded by carefully orchestrating her appearances, relying on trusted aides to manage details and exercising strategic discretion to conserve her energy for the most critical tasks. The hidden influence of her health-shaped policy, public offense, and courtly interactions, demonstrating once again that her private struggles were inseparable from the broader narrative of her reign. Despite the challenges, Elizabeth's intellect, political skill, and understanding of human behavior allowed her to navigate these years with remarkable resilience. She continued to employ wit, ceremony, and carefully cultivated presence to command respect, maintain authority, and project the enduring image of a sovereign in control. The mask, though straining under the weight of time and infirmity, remained a tool of governance, ensuring that the Queen's influence extended across the nation and abroad. Even as fatigue and the inevitability of mortality became more pressing, Elizabeth used the tools she had mastered over decades to safeguard her legacy. The final years were also marked by reflection and strategic consideration of succession. With no direct heir and an aging body, the Queen had to consider the continuity of the realm and the stability of governance after her passing. Every word, gesture, and policy decision was informed by this awareness, further emphasizing the dual nature of her mask. It was both protective and performative, concealing private concern while signaling unbroken authority. Elizabeth's ability to balance the personal and political, the visible and the hidden, became increasingly central to her enduring effectiveness as monarch. Elizabeth's relationships with advisors, courtiers, and foreign dignitaries in her final years continued to be mediated by careful perception management. While she relied on trusted figures for execution of policy and negotiation, the Queen remained the ultimate arbiter of judgment, reinforcing the necessity of her public persona. Every audience, correspondence, and ceremonial act was orchestrated to preserve the image of vitality and control, even as the Queen contended with the realities of aging and illness. This meticulous management of appearance ensured that England remained confident in her rule and that her authority was not perceived as diminished. The psychological burden of maintaining the mask intensified with age. Decades of vigilance, strategic calculation, and personal restraint had trained Elizabeth in extraordinary discipline. Yet the accumulation of private struggles and the awareness of mortality introduced new challenges. Moments of private vulnerability were carefully concealed, and the Queen continued to wield perception as a weapon and shield. The tension between the demands of public performance and private reality underscored the extraordinary complexity of leadership, particularly for a female monarch navigating a male-dominated society. Even in her final years, Elizabeth's mask allowed her to leave a lasting impression on the cultural, political, and diplomatic fabric of England. The enduring image of the Virgin Queen, resolute, poised, and formidable, was maintained until her final days, ensuring that contemporaries and future generations would remember her authority as unbroken. Yet, behind this carefully constructed exterior lay a woman contending with decades of physical strain, emotional solitude, and the inexorable challenges of sustaining absolute power. The mask, once a tool of protection and influence, now carried the weight of endurance and the quiet testimony of a lifetime of vigilance. Ultimately, the final years of Elizabeth I reveal a profound interplay between personal struggle, public performance, and historical legacy. The Queen's ability to maintain authority, navigate complex political landscapes, and project an image of unwavering strength despite illness and fatigue underscores the extraordinary demands of leadership. Her life illustrates that the veneer of power is inseparable from the human cost of sustaining it, and that the greatest achievements of governance often rest upon hidden resilience, calculated perception, and the ability to endure in the face of isolation and vulnerability. What Elizabeth's solitude teaches us about strength, fear, and legacy. As Elizabeth I's life drew to a close, the true weight of her reign became visible not just in her achievements, but in the profound solitude that had accompanied every decision, every victory, and every carefully choreographed appearance. Throughout her decades on the throne, the Queen had cultivated an image of invincibility. The Virgin Queen, the unassailable monarch, the emblem of England's prosperity and power. Yet, behind the pageantry, the ceremonies, and the public displays of authority lay a life shaped by private struggle, persistent illness, and the isolating demands of leadership. In her solitude, Elizabeth reveals the often overlooked dimensions of strength, the courage to bear unseen burdens, the resilience to maintain composure under constant scrutiny, and the wisdom to navigate a world where trust was rare and fear was pervasive. Elizabeth's isolation was not merely physical, it was psychological, political, and cultural. She existed in a world constructed by men, where assumptions about gender, loyalty, and authority threatened to undermine her position at every turn. In this environment, solitude became both a shield and a tool. It allowed her to make decisions, free from the sway of undue influence, to anticipate threats before they emerged, and to exercise judgment with clarity and precision. Yet solitude also exacted a cost. The absence of companionship, the inability to share burdens, and the constant awareness that every misstep could be magnified into scandal or weakness. Her life teaches us that true strength often requires bearing burdens that others cannot see, and that courage is as much about endurance and self-control as it is about action. The lessons of fear are equally intertwined with Elizabeth's solitude. Fear in her reign was never simple. It was a constant companion, manifesting as concern for political stability, threats of foreign invasion, religious unrest, and the fragility of succession. Yet Elizabeth's response to fear was not paralysis, but strategic engagement. She recognized danger without allowing it to dictate her actions, converting anxiety into prudence and apprehension into foresight. The Queen's example demonstrates that fear, when acknowledged and managed thoughtfully, can become a guide rather than a limitational lens through which decisions are sharpened and leadership is strengthened. Elizabeth's legacy, perhaps the most enduring aspect of her life, is inseparable from her solitude. She created a realm that celebrated learning, exploration, art, and diplomacy. And yet these achievements were inseparable from the personal strategies she employed to preserve authority and manage perception. By carefully navigating rumor, illness, political intrigue, and the complexities of a male-dominated society, Elizabeth not only survived, but thrived, leaving a kingdom poised for continued prosperity. Her legacy illustrates that the measure of leadership is not only the accomplishments that are visible to the world, but also the unseen choices, sacrifices, and fortitude that sustain those accomplishments over time. The solitude of Elizabeth's reign also reveals the intimate relationship between power and self. To govern effectively, she had to trust herself above all else, weighing counsel, but ultimately making decisions grounded in her own judgment and understanding. She cultivated independence of thought, emotional resilience, and a capacity for reflection that allowed her to act decisively, even when external support was incomplete or unreliable. For modern audiences, this aspect of her reign provides a timeless lesson. True strength often arises from internal mastery and the courage to face challenges alone, even in the presence of advisors, allies, or well-wishers. Moreover, Elizabeth's life underscores the way that perception and reality intertwine in leadership. Her carefully managed public image, the mask she wore for decades, was not mere artifice. It was a tool of governance, a mechanism to protect her authority and ensure the stability of the realm. Through her mastery of appearances, she navigated the complex dynamics of court, diplomacy, and popular expectation, shaping both her legacy and the trajectory of her nation. The Queen's ability to balance the tension between vulnerability and strength, between fear and action, illustrates the delicate, often invisible work required to wield authority effectively. In reflecting on Elizabeth's solitude, we also encounter a meditation on resilience. Her life demonstrates that leadership is rarely glamorous or easy. It is demanding, isolating, and fraught with uncertainty. The strength she displayed was not only in the victories she achieved, but in the quiet endurance required to maintain composure, make difficult decisions, and continue guiding her people under constant scrutiny. The isolation she bore highlights the human dimensions of power, the sacrifices, the unseen labor, and the inner fortitude necessary to sustain a nation. Elizabeth's reign offers another enduring insight: the interplay between fear and strategy. While fear was ever present, from plots against her life to the possibility of political upheaval, the Queen never allowed it to define her rule. Instead, she converted awareness of danger into informed decision-making, anticipating challenges before they materialized and crafting solutions with foresight and precision. This ability to navigate fear with intelligence rather than reaction demonstrates that leadership requires both courage and prudence, and that the most formidable rulers are often those who can manage their own anxieties while shaping the actions of others. Finally, the solitude that defined Elizabeth's life encourages reflection on the nature of legacy. Her accomplishments, the cultural renaissance, the strengthening of national identity, the navigation of foreign threats, and the preservation of political stability were inseparable from the discipline, foresight, and emotional endurance cultivated through decades of isolation. Elizabeth's story teaches us that legacy is built not only in moments of triumph, but in the sustained labor of character, judgment, and resilience. It reminds us that what is visible to history is often supported by a foundation of unseen perseverance, discipline, and strategic endurance. In the quiet of her final days, Elizabeth I remained a sovereign in command, holding tight to the mask she had worn for decades. Her solitude, while personal and at times painful, was inseparable from the power she wielded and the legacy she crafted. For those who study her life today, it offers profound lessons. That strength is measured not only in public victories, but in the capacity to endure privately. That fear can be a guide rather than a limitation, and that the truest legacies are those forged through unwavering discipline, wisdom, and resilience. As we leave the story of Elizabeth I behind, we are reminded of the extraordinary balance between human vulnerability and extraordinary achievement. In her life, we see that power carries isolation, that leadership requires the careful navigation of fear, and that the measure of greatness lies as much in the unseen struggle as in the celebrated triumphs. And so, as the halls of the Tudor court grow silent, and the golden light of Elizabeth's reign fades into history, we are left with the quiet, enduring lesson of a queen who bore solitude with grace, intelligence, and indomitable strength, an enduring testament to the complexity, resilience, and humanity that lie at the heart of true leadership.